to our first panel of the symposium. My name is Emily McManus. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Music, and I have the pleasure today of introducing our presenters. The theme for our first panel is travel and memory, and we will be hearing from three faculty members from the Departments of Art, Humanistic Studies, and English Writing. The sort of format we're going to use today is to hear each of the presentations back to back, and then I'll ask you to hold your questions, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So to go ahead and just jump on in and get started, our first presentation today is by Ian Weaver. Ian Weaver is an assistant professor in the Department of Art. His exhibitions include a survey of work at the South Bend Museum of Art, as well as solo exhibitions at the Chicago Cultural Center, the Indianapolis Museum of Contemporary Art, the St. Louis Art Museum, and the Packer Shop Gallery in Chicago, Illinois. He's been a recipient of numerous residencies, including the Oxbow, the ISCP residency in New York, Yedo and the Millay Colony, both in upstate New York, and Ragdale in Lake Forest, Illinois. Awards include the Stone and DeGuire Contemporary Art Award, Artadia and the Joan Mitchell Foundation grants, the Illinois Art Council grants, and grants from the Department of Cultural Affairs in Chicago, Illinois. Professor Weaver's presentation for today is titled Place, Community, and the Construction of Identity.
Hello. So I am excited to present on these themes of place and memory because they represent one of the many intersections of my research interests, and as such raise the primary question I would like the viewer to ask when encountering my work, namely, why would someone make fake work about a real place? Historically, constructed realities have been popularly presented in film, television, The Man in the High Castle, and literature, the fake memoir craze of a few years past, with examples such as Misha, a memoir of the Holocaust years, or James Frey's A Million Little Pieces. We see examples in our current cultural landscape as well, with individuals like former regional NAACP President Rachel Dolezal insisting that race is only a construct and that, quote, black is a culture, a philosophy, a political and social view. Never mind the fact that she's only half right, but that's a more complicated subject for a different symposium, I guess. For me, growing up on the south side of Chicago and knowing the history of my mother's childhood and home, construction is a way to express a loss of place and really a form of wish fulfillment for me. So basically what I wanted to do is go through the slides that I have and talk to you a little bit about my background and my mom's background and how I tie these things together in my own research. So first of all, I'm from Chicago. I grew up on the far southeast side of Chicago. My mom grew up in a neighborhood called the Near West Side, Maxwell Street area. Don't know how many people are familiar with Chicago or that area. Right now it's the UIC Village community, so sort of west and south of the downtown loop area of Chicago. She grew up in that area in the 40s and 50s. So before the expressway came in, before UIC, and it was a multi-ethnic, multicultural community. She grew up around people from Germany and Italy, immigrants from all over the world. Very different experience than I had growing up and a lot of my peers had growing up. When I moved into that area in Pilsen, which is just south of the UIC Village, about a mile south of that area, I was really sort of interested in finding out more about this community that had essentially been destroyed. So it started with, in the mid-50s, the construction of the expressway system, mid to late 50s. And then in the 60s, the removal of the Maxwell Street open market. And then finally, in the 60s and 70s, the construction of the UIC campus. So that community looks nothing like it did even in 2000, let alone in 1940 and 50 when my mom was growing up in that community. So a lot of the community history was lost. A lot of the family history was lost as well. My grandfather was a Baptist minister, had his own church, owned his own property and his own store. All of that was lost. And so when I moved into that community, first I was doing a completely different kind of work. I was trained as a painter and a printmaker, figurative artist, and so I started thinking about different ways in which I could start to tell the history and the story of that community and my family's history more specifically. So I started working with my mom collaboratively to find documents and ephemera, materials, photographs, anything that would tell the family's history, because a lot of the history was lost. And so out of that collaboration arose this body of work. It's a series of 10 paintings. I'll only show a few of them. Again, I was really interested in this idea of sort of like trompe l'oeil, which is a concept of fool the eye or trick the eye in art. You know, the artist makes a painting of an image or an object, and it's meant to literally fool the viewer into believing that it's a real thing. I wanted to use that as a conceptual metaphor for this lost history, the making of a lost history that, well, maybe this was a real history, maybe I'm recreating a history that was lost, maybe I'm creating a whole new history. So I wanted there to be a little bit of a slippage for the viewer, not really being sure what they were looking at. So this was a perfect sort of metaphor for me in terms of the format that I used for painting, which was very different than what I had done before. So what I'm showing is a series of oil on panel paintings that I did between 2004 and 2006. The entire series is titled Document. And so I will go through a few of these. And so basically the entire series is made up of documents that my mom found in her search when we were working collaboratively on the family history. And so after doing about 10 of these documents, I realized that, number one, the only documents that we had, the documents that she found, were documents that were government-issued documents. So I had an idea of what, you know, family documents should be like, and it wasn't death certificates or birth certificates or things of that nature, but that's all we had. My grandfather's death certificate. And so all of these are a little bit larger than life size, so 13 by 14 oil on panel. My mother's Social Security card. There's a funny story behind that. Her actual Social Security number is underneath that redacted box, and she didn't, it actually was on display for a little bit with her number on it. I'm not sure why I did that, but and she was at the opening, and so that was one of the pieces that came down and then was redacted and came back up and was retitled. I actually can't even remember what the original title was for it. Maybe Mom's Social Security number. Not very good title. So I was really concerned about the fact that over the course of these 10 documents, I was telling the family history using this entity that had played a major role in destroying the family history, and that was problematic for me. I was happy with the series, and I think in terms of where I was at and where I was going with this idea of documenting the family history, I was happy with it at that point, but the fact that I didn't find what I thought were family documents, long lost letters, letters from long lost relatives, or photos or things like that, that was a real disappointment for me. But it was also an opportunity for me to think about, first of all, the idea that I had about what memory and history and documentation, family, communal, community documentation would be, but then also this idea that I had as an artist, this sort of freedom to talk about and draw sort of a light on, or show a light on the fact that, there's a reason why this history doesn't exist anymore. And one of the ways that I could do that is simply by questioning my own sort of motivations for wanting to do this sort of nostalgic retelling of the family history. And it really was this sort of nostalgic impulse that I had to sort of grapple with. So basically, since I didn't have the information that I wanted, I decided that I would recreate that information. So I essentially started creating the family history that didn't exist, which is, again, is this idea of a wish fulfillment, recreating something or creating something that never existed based on a real community that actually did exist at one point. So I'll quickly run through a few different things here. The first iteration of that was a Black Bottom History Museum, which was a museum that I created, a completely faux history museum for the Black Bottom community. The Black Bottom community was the black community, the black section of the near west side of Chicago, where my mom grew up in. So it's made up of a lot of different elements that didn't exist in any format before, some that are completely recreations, some that are assemblage, collage. They existed in some element, some form, but I created a new provenance or a new history for them. I'll run through a few of these images from that. Really interested in ethnographic elements as well as a part of my general research, this idea of being on the outside and looking at the other and understanding it through these sort of subjective objects. And then also this idea, I was never left that idea of this sort of slippage of what we're looking at, is this real or not? This entire museum was installed at the Kemper Museum in St. Louis. And so when people came through, they thought it was a part of the museum's installation, thought it was curated from within. And they wondered why these elements that were from the 70s, Jet magazines that were purportedly a part of a exhibition that was centered on the 1940s and 1950s, why this information was here. So I was wanting the viewer to kind of question these decisions that I was making. And then as I continued, and I'll go back really quickly, you can see that one element here on the white pedestal. I started getting into sculpture quite a bit, and I was really interested in this idea of assemblage as not only as a formal or aesthetic way of working, but also as a way of conceptually bringing together, like a collage in real space, bringing together disparate elements, this hybridity of different cultures. So it was an element that was really important to me. But I felt that with this history museum, I hadn't really flushed it out as thoroughly as I could have. So I separated the Black Knights, and I basically created this group that never existed, a hybrid group, part heraldic European tradition, and part Black nationalists, which were different elements that I was also pulling from both in my study of European painting as a painter, and also just as a Black man in Chicago. So I created all of these elements, these ephemeral documents, coat of arms, another version of the Black Power helmet, gauntlets. I also, and I'll talk really briefly about maps, but I also started getting more into map making, and map making was incredibly, and still is really incredibly important to me, because it speaks probably more perfectly than sculpture or painting or any of the other things that I've done to all of my research elements, this idea of place at its core. Place and maps as being representatives of place in the sense that maps talk about a region, but they also are inherently false, sometimes purposely false. You think of propaganda maps during the war. But they also have an inherent history that is about this sort of verisimilitude, this believability. People, when they look at maps, they believe what they're looking at as being accurate. And all of those elements were important for me with what I was working on. For people to believe in what they were looking at as being accurate, for the element that I was using, the format that I was using, having an existing historical weight to it, and that it also spoke about place. So I did a series of different maps, Black Knight migration map. They all sort of talk about the history of these fictional Black Knights and their, in this case, migration from Africa to the Americas, to the South, to eventually Illinois to Chicago, which in this case obviously mimics a couple of movements of Black bodies throughout history, the Middle Passage and also the Great Migration. And I was, again, really interested in, sculptural elements, making my own official seals. This is a completely unusable seal. If you were to ink it and print it up, it would just print a black spot right in the middle. So it's meant more as a sculpture, a faux object. But then I also made an actual seal stamp screen print of that image. So very quickly, I know that I'm out of time because it's 15 minutes, but I wanted to show you a few of the elements that I'm working on now, more of the Black Knights, and slowing down the sort of narrative, talking about the Black Knights' migration specifically rather than their entire history within the near West Side community. And these are images from the Cultural Center, some of the sculptural elements that I started getting into. And maybe as we start to talk a little bit more and have our questions, I can talk a little bit about some of my interests in object theory and memory, ethnography, anthropology, which all fuel the work that I've been producing really over the last 20 years. And my shameless plug. Thank you very much.
Our next presentation is a presentation by Professor Laura Williamson-Ambrose. Professor Williamson-Ambrose is the chair of the Department of Humanistic Studies, where she teaches courses on ancient, medieval, and early modern European literature. Her research focuses on domestic mobility, the history of cartography, and transportation technologies in 17th century English literature and culture. She has published on Shakespeare's communication networks and the rise of almanac travel diaries, and she has 2 articles forthcoming this fall on female travelers in early modern England. Professor Williamson-Ambrose's presentation for today is Women's Travel, Writing, and Memory in 17th Century England. Welcome to Professor Williamson-Ambrose.
Okay, so thank you, Emily, for that introduction. And to Ian, because now I have so many questions to ask you. Oops, what am I doing? Okay, so I added a comma to my title just because it looked better. In order to begin, I'd actually like to start with a story. And that story is that in the summer of 2001, freshly graduated from college and without the funds to go on a European backpacking tour, I loaded some camping gear, packaged food and clothes into a van, and headed across the country with my now husband, Alex. In just over a month, we drove coast to coast from the Jersey Shore to Los Angeles and back again. When compared to the foreign adventures of our peers, this trip was really nothing special. No passports, no plane rides, just us in an old van. On the other hand, It was something special and covered nearly, well, actually over 6,000 miles, marked the first time I had ever left the East Coast, not to mention the country, which I hadn't done until that point. We experienced cultural difference and similitude, new languages, vastly different topographical features, extreme fatigue and laughter, all the hallmarks of a grand adventure abroad, yet I was right here at home. How did I, make sense of a mere domestic journey? Render it meaningful in the face of cultural cachets related to, for example, trips abroad. Like all travelers, we did so through the aid of particular travel technologies and travel texts. The first, travel technologies, affected how we experienced the journey. An old van, calling cards, or phone, even more crazy phone booths, which we used, no cell phones. And the greatest dinosaur of them all, the road atlas, and that is actually the road atlas that we used. I've saved it for posterity. The second was travel records, and these my students are more familiar with. These help to shape the meaning-making aspect of the journey. We used actual photographs, right? Which means they were limited because it cost a lot of money to develop a roll of film. And we were not in any together, really, because no selfies. And we also had a ledger-like journal, which to my extreme regret, I cannot find. And basically what it was a list of how much money we spent and every single road we took. And I don't know why we did it that way, but the idea, I think, was just to keep track of where we had been. But freshly out of college, we also needed to keep track of every penny. So I mention this because it carries all the hallmarks of my research. In the 17th century and in the 21st, our experiences of mobility, however close to home, are deeply connected to the technologies we employ as part of those experiences, and how we record those experiences, photos, journals, paintings, dictates what and how we remember. So in a nutshell, this is how I envision my research into domestic travel, is the intersection between texts, technologies, and memory. I think it's worth noting, too, why the word texts is at the apex of this Venn diagram, particularly on a day in which words like travel and memory are productive conceptual categories for disciplines across the range here at St. Mary's. As someone who researches the history of science and technology, what business do I have calling myself a literary scholar? In my own defense, I am a card-carrying member of the Shakespeare Association of America. But the truth really lies in method. At the core, and like all literary scholars, I believe that words matter deeply to how we experience the world, how we process it, how we record our experiences of it, and how we make meaning of it. Attending to the written record, then, particularly the imaginative and conceptual archive that forms the core of the literary canon, helps us to not only recognize facts, but also shifting habits of mind and ways of imagining the world. We ask, why did a writer say it that way? And what does that way tell us about ways of thinking at the time? So what I'd like to do with the time that I have left with you here today is give you essentially a lay of the land. What was travel actually like in the 17th century? Then move on to a kind of literary case study, if I can go so far as to claim that method, and to talk to you a little bit about my more recent work on a woman by the name of Lady Anne Clifford. And then lastly, to end by returning to that trip and asking the question I always ask of my students, who cares? So, 17th century. In Europe, in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was a period marked by a tremendous amount of movement. The rise of foreign travel and piracy, the circumnavigation of the globe, the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, colonialism, the migration of religious refugees, and the Grand Tour, which is, of course, the early modern precursor to study abroad. Really. Central to all of these enterprises was the development of new technologies of travel, the atlas, navigational instruments, the standardization of the mile, the survey, all of which fundamentally changed how people understood their relationship to space, both abroad and, as I'm interested in, at home. So how do people actually move around? Well, as is often, and I would say still the case, class matters, right? So for common folks, there were basically four options. One was walking, and that was free. But everything else required money. Riding a horse, or borrowing a horse, or essentially renting a horse, hitching a ride on a wagon, or basically renting or using basic watercraft to cross rivers or estuaries or things of that sort. For wealthier landowners and aristocrats, though, especially for women and children, and I can talk more about that later, several covered and costly technologies were at their disposal. And I have two here for you, the sedan chair and the horse litter. These, of course, had been established modes of transport for centuries, nor were they particular to England. We have evidence of their use in the Far East, in the Levant, and, of course, the European continent. So what happens in 17th century England that's really worth paying attention to? One immediate answer is migration and population. So between 1550 and 1650, population nearly quadrupled in England, basically catapulting countless migrants, betterment migrants, which is what we call them, people in search of work, onto the road, and most of which were headed to London. Another answer, though, about what makes the 17th century such a big deal is new technologies. And the one that I'm particularly intrigued by is the coach. This was admittedly an old technology, one that for many, many centuries had carried a kind of social cachet. Queen Elizabeth is famous for including one in one of her processions, but it was empty because you didn't even need to be in it in order for it to carry that kind of symbolic value. But the early modern period brought us three crucial changes: technological development, scale, and practices of use. The vehicles became, frankly, more comfortable, more practical. So you could get things like upholstered seats, curtains, you could choose the fabric. There were basic shock systems. Windows were used to keep the weather out, which of course is a big deal in England. But also they were made available to the public, and I would argue this is the biggest thing that changed the social landscape for travel. And really the thing to think about is the pre-modern taxi, because of course you could hire one to get somewhere. And even more remarkable still, and this is another side project of mine, is when by the middle of the 1600s they stopped along predictable routes, which is of course the bus system. That's why the British refer to buses as coaches, by the way. These developments introduced new possibilities and practices for travel. Walk to the play or take a coach. As well as new problems like traffic. There were countless pamphlets against coaches because of all the traffic they caused. And unemployment. So the watermen, who were typically the ones who were responsible for ferrying people across the Thames to go to the Globe, were suddenly out of work. So how did all of these technological and social changes affect women? Many have argued they didn't. One of the oft-recited points about women and travel in the early modern period is that they simply didn't do it. Prohibited from international or even domestic travel without special license, expected to avoid physical labor, and certainly the corrupting influence of those Catholic papists in Italy, women were largely rendered immobile. Except they weren't really. Coaches alone expanded the terrain for women's domestic mobility, and this increased even more when they became available to the public. Which brings me to my point. What spatial practices count as travel? Walking across one's own neighborhood, on one's own property, riding between estates in the country. And what records count as travel texts? Personal diaries, maps. What did you call them, Ian? Fake maps or fake matter? That sort of a thing. That intrigues me as well. These all matter a great deal to the stories that we tell of travel itself. So one case in point is Lady Anne Clifford. She was extremely wealthy and very well positioned. Her father was one of Queen Elizabeth's privateers, and privateer is basically a fancy way of saying pirate, in fact, government state-sanctioned pirate. And she and her family lived at the court. One of the greatest landowners of her era, a status that she achieved after decades of legal battles with two husbands and even King James, all of which tried to take her inheritance away from her. She was incredibly prolific, penning hundreds of pages between the age of 13 and up until her death in 1676. And she moved around a lot, and you can see the two sort of groupings of her residences, London in the south and the northwestern castles, which I'll talk about a bit later. And most miraculous still, she wrote it all down. We have 70 years of recorded mobility. And yet, nobody pays attention. Right? Neither her journeys nor her writings are typically talked about in the context of travel. And this is largely because the movements are regional, they're local. But I would also argue it's because the texts themselves are mind-numbingly boring. They are, but that is exactly what I love. So, to my sort of big research question, if we change how we look at travel, who does it, where it happens, how it is recorded, what can that tell us about how Clifford, and perhaps aristocratic women more broadly, made sense of their movements through space and time? When we do this, when we ask that kind of a question, new things emerge. For example, if we take this passage from the summer of 1603, on its surface, it basically reminds us of Clifford's social network, right? She's sort of name-dropping. She's following Queen Anne on her progress north. She's in the in crowd, as in of a crowd as you can get at this point in time. But read more carefully, she is an experienced 13-year-old regional traveler who rode on horseback over 90 miles north of London. That's basically the equivalent of a trip from here to Kalamazoo or even farther. It breaks down to about 20 to 30 miles a day, which was the sort of typical max at the time, no matter how you were traveling, which partially explains why, and you can see this in red, she and her mother actually killed 3 horses from exhaustion, which was not unheard of. It was actually something you had to be very careful of. They journeyed on only 4 hours of sleep, and they rode at night, only to find their friendly neighborhood castle was locked. They had gone to sleep for the night. But at the age of 59, Lady Anne finally acquired the legal rights to her ancestral lands in the north, including this medieval structure, Broome Castle, in the county of Westmoreland. During this time, she restored each of these castles, and I've circled them here in red so you can mark them out, moving between them on average every few months. As an aristocrat, she had many transportation options at her disposal, the aforementioned coach, but when she got older, all of the jostling bothered her, so she used a horse litter. But of most interest to me is the fact that she begins to methodically record every year's events in annual records or annual summaries, one for every year between 1649 and 1676 when she dies. They contain sort of typical details, in many ways, births and deaths of family members, visits, people who visit her. Occasionally, she pays attention to the world around her, national events. But the single greatest obsession of the summaries is travel. She records each and every, and I mean each and every, change of residence, or what she calls removes, and I just think that's fascinating that she gives it its own word. How she does this is, of course, very interesting. Looking at the passage above from 1671, and she's 81 at this point, you can see that Lady Anne records each leg of her journey in a kind of itinerant list, which you can follow either on the passage or on the map here. I've marked them out with arrows. Winfield Park, or Forest, Julian Bower, which you don't have on the map, a series of smaller towns and villages, and finally Appleby Castle. In other words, unlike other travel documents or travel narratives of the era, there's absolutely no reference to the travel experience itself, what it felt like. No account for heat, hunger, danger, no conversations, no observations, no encounters, nothing. It is simply a meticulous record of her place in space and time, including each and every 10 to 30 mile journey or remove that she took over the course of several decades. So why exactly Clifford writes this way and travels this way is what intrigues me. I'm cheating. It's likely, I think at least, a symbolic gesture over her land, and others have said this as well. I move through this land, I name these places, therefore they are mine. I mean, after decades of trying to claim that something is yours, I think you'd want to really make that point clear. It's also likely an effort to claim ownership over her personhood. During the middle periods of her life, which I skipped over, she was effectively prohibited from even leaving her house in many ways. Part of it was because of the Civil War, but part of it was because her husbands did not allow her to leave. So we can talk about that later if you want. But it is also a way to reclaim the past, or at least her memories of it, because while Clifford clearly had future ancestors in mind as an audience for much of her textual output, these annual summaries also had a more local audience in mind, and that was herself. There are references within the summaries themselves that reveal the fact that she reread them, probably again and again. Essentially then, in rereading, Clifford is able to relive the experience in her mind. The memories of those places and events become layered and reshaped and rewritten over time. I'm no neuroscientist. For that, you'll actually have to wait an hour. We have 2 coming. But I often liken this to the neural pathways of the brain. In other words, if the brain is the northwestern countryside of England, and it can be, Her memory, or route across this expanse, is literally being recorded, and retrenched with each and every travel passage, over and over and over, until it becomes a newly constructed memory pathway through the landscape and through her own mind. For an example of that, I'd like to return to the account of her trip from Broome to Appleby. See above there in just a moment. This time specifically focusing on the reference to the pillar that I have pictured here, and you can sort of see that also in the red. The story behind the pillar is this. In 1616, Clifford's mother dies when Lady Anne herself is only 26. She was extremely close to her mother, and their parting was a particularly tragic affair, in part because it was the last time she saw her, but also this was a moment at which the only reason she had been given permission to go see her mother by her husband was so that she could convince her mother to give him their inheritance when they died. Both women refused, so he took the servants away and basically forced her to flee. So, terrible story. 38 years later, Clifford commissions this monument, a sundial, the Countess's Pillar, and places it in the exact location she last saw her mother, which is a quarter-mile south of Broome Castle. So, in 1671, to bring us back to our passage, at 81 years old, Lady Anne insists on writing this pillar into her travel record as a waypoint, the first waypoint in her journey, one that she had seen many times before. And you can see this in red. I took my horse litter in which I rid by the pillar that I erected in memory of my last parting there with my blessed mother, etc., etc. So in doing this, Clifford effectively replaces a memory of fleeting hopelessness and loss with one of agency and permanence. In doing this and thinking about it this way, I like to think that she's really just taking control again. Travel and travel writing allow her to reshape the past and the meaning of this particular site. So, to conclude, 4 takeaways here. Obviously, her travels are not entirely like mine across the country. First of all, I'm not an aristocrat, but I do think, hate to break it to you, but I do think there are 4 sort of contiguous threads. The first is quite simple, but yet I think even still overlooked, that domestic travel is in fact travel. Technologies of travel shape how movement is understood, and that travel texts shape and reflect that understanding. And then lastly, that process of meaning making really does happen through remembering or remembering. My true last slide here is one I can't resist, which is because I'd like to suggest your next vacation destination. A walking holiday, which is what they call sort of like hiking vacations in England. They're very popular. You can take a 5, 6, or 9-day package to walk Lady Anne's way, when you can walk in her footsteps, or as is probably more likely the case, horse hooves, and follow her way, albeit 340 years later.
Well, I hope you're starting to come up with a lot of interesting questions. I know that I certainly am. We have one more presentation before we open it up for questions. Our third and final presentation for this panel is by Professor Dion Irving-Briemeyer. Professor Irving-Briemeyer is an assistant professor of creative writing in the English department. Her work has appeared in the Missouri Review, Lit Hub, the Normal School, and other places. Her research and writing interests include travel writing, colonized fictions, literary journalism, and narratology. She is currently searching for a home for her novel Quint, which follows the lives of a set of famous Canadian quintuplets born in the year before the Second World War. Professor Briemeyer's presentation for today is titled The French Connection.
Thank you all so much for coming. I don't have slides, unfortunately. But I am going to tell a story, which I think sort of rounds out our presentations nicely for today. The French national motto is Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Liberty, equality, fraternity. When you say the words in English, it sounds almost like the rallying cries for this republic. And it is no wonder the beginning of the United States precedes the contemporary French state by only a few years. The phrase originated during the French Revolution, and those heads taken by those French citizens, haloed by the guillotine in all its open guts and bloody glory, bespeaks a kind of passion and fierceness that has less to do with taxation and more to do with starvation. And yet the contemporary image of France and popular culture in this country, of snobbery, effete, culturally isolationist people. And here's the thing. This is what I love about France. I am, after all, a cat person. I'm suspicious of love and kindness given too openly. I like to work for it. And for France, work I do, trying to make France love me as much as I love it. To engage, to feel connected to the country whose language I speak, whose food I love. Trains arrive and leave Paris's Gare du Nord at a rapid clip. In the past 13 years, I've been to the Gare du Nord station more times than I can count. It is the first train station I came to during my first trip to France 13 years ago. I took a taxi from the train station to Montmartre. Terrified, I strapped myself in as we traveled at breakneck speeds through the streets of Paris. The drizzly rain covered everything, blurring my vision, and I was disappointed by the ordinariness of it all. I wanted romance, not a Gap or a McDo, as the French called McDonald's. Not a dog relieving itself in front of a sidewalk cafe. In French, I asked the driver how long the rain would last, if the traffic was typical for this time of day. We made small talk for a few minutes, finding enough comfort together that he finally said, "I can't place your accent. Where in France are you from?" He pretended at first, circling his real question out of a sense of propriety, I suppose, guessing Burgundy and then the suburbs outside of Paris. Finally, he asked me more honestly if my accent was born in Algeria or Côte d'Ivoire, two of the many countries that France colonized during their 446 years as a colonial power. As it always has, colonization complicates things, mixes things up. And it's why I'm a girl with Jamaican parents born in Canada who speaks French fluently. 88% of the French population speaks French as their first language. However, the government offers no legal recognition of minority languages. And so even those who may not speak French as their first language must learn so they can fill out forms, gain employment, and live. It's easier. Unlike language, race in France is complicated. A French study released in 2015 revealed that 65% of the French population openly admitted that they have some kind of racial prejudice. The French culture of racism is so deeply ingrained, so buried in some cases, that you have to pay attention to find it. And all the while, the French will deny it. Muslims, often of African or Middle Eastern descent, face discrimination in hiring because of Arabic-sounding names. Égalité. The French Constitution forbids the keeping of records based on race, religion, or sex. Égalité. And yet there is Charlie Hebdo. Égalité. And the child care provided by my sister's daycare in Marseille, where they tell my sister that my 8-month-old niece is a tease because she smiles at the boy babies and then scrams when they get too close. Égalité. There's something beneath the surface of this taxi driver's question. He wanted to know if I was one of them, of what in France they call clando, or immigrants without papers, an equivalent of that peculiarly American phrase, illegal immigrant, as if a person could be herself illegal. It was petulant of me, I suppose, but I waited several beats before explaining to him that I was Canadian. "You don't sound Canadian. You speak French very well." I am technically proficient, like a voiceover on a commercial or an automated voice service. I speak a crisp, accentless French. I've spoken French nearly as long as I have spoken. Starting in kindergarten, I spent 14 years of education entirely in French. But this driver's comment about the way I speak is something I hear everywhere in the world. And perhaps this type of direct address of my perceived curiousness is also part of the larger phenomenon known popularly as traveling while black. People in the US, in Canada, in France, in the UK, in Italy, in China, in Jamaica, wherever I've gone, make sure to remind me of the ways in which I don't sound the way they expect me to. Something about this is apparently unsettling. My French, like my English, can sometimes sound stilted, as though I've learned the rules of the language, but not its seasonings. The next morning, after a night of restless, jet-lag sleep, I took the metro into the city center. The air was crisp after the cooling rain, and a bright sunlight dappled the pavement. I'd woken early so I could roam the empty streets, imagining the romance of Paris, all wrought iron balconies and cafes. I walked up the Champs-Élysées, peeking in shop windows, pulling in the smell of warm pastries into my lungs. At the end of the giant French boulevard, I carried on into a residential area that had also begun its day early. It was midweek and people had already left for work. Walking, peeking in on these lives, I imagined what it would be like to live there, to make a life for myself there. I couldn't picture it. The sky darkened and I picked up my pace, walking vaguely toward the Eiffel Tower, the symbol of all things French. As I rounded the corner and looked up, I saw it. I hadn't expected it, but the tower looked dreary, huddled by gathering clouds and glutted with tourists, ice cream vendors, and crepe stands. The tower was built by Gustave Eiffel, born Alexandre Gustave Bonnickhausen. Although born in France, Eiffel's family adopted the name as a reference to the German mountain Eiffel from which they hailed. So what's in a name? The etymology of my own first name is that it comes from Dionysus, the Greek god of wine. The mythological Dione was wife to Zeus and mother of Aphrodite. In its contemporary incarnation, the name has French-Canadian connections. And although there's nothing remotely French about our Caribbean parents, my sister Adrienne and I both have names of French origin. But sometimes Americans forget or ignore the mythology and the narrative of America that suggests if you produce enough generations and if you immerse yourself thoroughly in its life and culture, at some point you become American. You reach the point where the generation that came before you is erased by the memory of time. France is not America. There is no similar transmogrification process. You are of German or Italian or English extraction unless you can trace yourself back to the Normans. You are African or Arab or Muslim, and you won't ever be anything but. Gustave Eiffel, a man who created a tangible symbol of France, who is still not entirely accepted by it, kept an apartment in the tower. And as I stood at the tower's base, my head tipped back to gaze up at it, I imagined Eiffel looking out over his adopted country, and I wonder if he felt like a foreigner too. A moment later, the clouds opened up and the rain came in at an angle. There was nowhere to stand for cover, and so I stood where I was and let myself get wet. Thoroughly soaked, the rain was still coming down hard. I walked to a taxi stand where a line of cabs stood waiting for tourists to climb in and to be spirited out of the rain. But the line wasn't moving. I looked toward the front and noticed two cabbies screaming back and forth at each other in French. Tourists from all over the world waited patiently in what had become a heavy drivel as the two men, one white, one Asian, dickered over a group of rain-soaked Americans wearing plastic ponchos and running shoes who waited to be crammed into the back of a cab. I watched as they exchanged worried looks, not understanding what was happening or the two men's rage. The drivers' voices rose and the argument got ugly and then uglier. The men jabbing their fingers in each other's faces, screaming and seemingly wanting to overwhelm each other with the wave of their voices. The argument reached a crescendo, and then it came. Shintok. The slur, as all slurs do, reduced him to his ethnicity. It ignored France's long history in Vietnam. It ignored colonialism and fairness and égalité. There was a pause and finally some quiet. The two men stared at each other for a moment, and then the white man turned and spit on the ground. The tourists got in his car. But I couldn't stop looking at the greasy glob of curdled spit and mucus, and I only looked away when I heard the other man say, "This is my country too. My country too." The white driver got into his cab, crammed with soggy tourists, and dipped into traffic so quickly I lost sight of the car almost immediately. I was reminded of those words nearly 11 years later when reading their twin in a New Yorker story called The Other France, released in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. A man, Ben Ahmed, of Algerian and Tunisian descent, is spat on by white extremists as he joins a vigil of tens of thousands. He argues with them, telling them, as much as he has as much right to be there as they do, France, he argues to the reporter, is his country. I hear a lot of that these days, an argument about who a country belongs to, putting our names on soil like an obnoxious roommate with a carton of milk, as though humans have any divine right to claim land. This manifestation of patriotism seems to counter the more universal goals of liberté, liberty, the state or condition of being free. I feel a kind of freedom in France that I don't think most Americans do when they travel there. There's freedom in travel that understands the language and the rhythms of a place. Black writers and artists have a history of coming to France in search of that liberté, the freedom to make a way out of no way. France was a haven for Josephine Baker, James Baldwin, Nina Simone, and Richard Wright, all of whom found a kind of liberté in France never available or accessible to them in America. France found them dazzling, was taken with their brown skin, with their talent. the Black Americans specifically became a French model minority, a group that, quote, benefited not only from a French fascination with blackness, but a French fascination about Americanness. While I was the first to go, it is my younger sister who has made a life for herself in France. She's lived there since 2011. My sister is an actress. She is tall and thin and has the kind of angular features that all cameras adore. She works sporadically there, getting calls to play almost exclusively prostitutes, single mothers, drug addicts, characters who crowd the suburban Paris high-rises, at least in the French imagination. She is rarely cast in these parts. Her skin isn't dark enough. Her accent, which is far more authentic than my own, is still too refined for such roles. The irony of this lies in the fact that even as France celebrates and welcomes the talented tenth of Black Americans, it actively discriminates against and oppresses the legions of citizens who come from those African countries France once colonized. It is a study in contradictions. My sister's husband, though, is thoroughly French. While his last name is of Scottish origin, it is his mother's maiden name, Angevin, which translates literally as angel wine, that informs his life. He runs a vineyard based in Saint-Tropez. The wine, which bears the name of his French family, is a rosé, bright and crisp. The process for making rosé is an oenology that involves crushing black-skinned grapes and allowing them to remain in short contact with the juice. The color of the skins is what gives the wine its rosy color. The angel wine starts with my brother-in-law's great-grandfather. His grandfather, a popular French television presenter in the 1950s, went another route. In spite of his success in France, internationally, he is best known because of the 6 years he spent in an American prison as an accessory for transporting 52 kilograms of heroin in a 1960 Buick. As you might expect, there are conflicting accounts about whether or not he knew his car was loaded with drugs, and his story remains a part of popular culture, in no part because of its depiction in the 1971 Academy Award-winning movie, The French Connection. In the bathroom of my sister's bright and spacious apartment in Marseille, they've hung a French poster for the film. It's odd to me and somewhat funny that the actor who plays my brother-in-law's grandfather in the film is tall and lanky and looks more like my brother-in-law than the pictures I've seen of his grandfather. The name The French Connection comes from the name for the drug cartel that operated in the streets of this sun-drenched town in southern France, a code name used by law enforcement for the ring that started in Corsica and grew to smuggling heroin from Turkey to Corsica into France via Marseille. Our name, last name my sister and I share, means very little. When our father died last year, we learned our grandparents' names for the first time while going through his papers, and yet we each hold on to that name out of a sense of nostalgia. It is the name I use to write, the name she uses to act. It is a bit of connection we have to each other and no one else. Neither of us is from anywhere. Neither of us have a country, a place, and even our name fades. Her new family name brings a kind of cultural cachet, a connection to a bit of 20th century ephemera, an amusing piece of dinner party conversation. If only I didn't suspect that there was real and sustained pain behind it. But a generation or two have had their effect. A bootlegger grandfather becomes dinner party conversation at a safe distance. A story about a cowboy grandfather ignores the potential genocide of the Old West. I suspect that by the time my niece is an adult, her grandmother's name, Angel Wine, will mean next to nothing to her. I imagine her telling the story to entertain a date or as an interesting fact during a college orientation icebreaker. The kilos of heroin won't mean anything. Only since 1993 have French parents had no restraint concerning what to name their children. The prior law, ironically enough, was created by Napoleon. However, a judge can still overrule a parent's choice if they decide that the child's name is not in the child's best interests. My tiny French niece is named for a famous American actress who died in France. That actress died only a few hours away from the vineyard that will someday belong to her. My niece, like my son, is biracial. In France, they call this métisse. Its literal translation means mixed. Many of the other children, like her in France, fit this designation. The city where she is growing up is one of the most ethnically diverse regions of France, and its location, right on the sea, its status as a port city, means that it has always been. The Mediterranean offers access to the Middle East and Africa, It connects Greece to Italy. It connects, I'm sorry, Greece and Italy. Marseille is a heady mixture of all of these cultures and people. Community, it seems, is the least tangible part of the French motto, and it's the one that America has rejected entirely. Because what does fraternité really mean? A body of men associated by some tie or common interest, as the OED explains. A second definition considers that fraternity is the state or quality of being fraternal or brotherly. It is a moral endeavor. Unlike liberty, unlike equality, it demands that French people feel community with each other. It means a commitment to each other. And without community, how can we have liberty or equality? One is implicit in the others. If we don't feel responsible for each other, then don't our other ideals fall apart? Before our most recent trip to France, I tried to teach my 1-year-old son some words in French. I want him to feel some connection to France, to French, to the place I find myself returning to again and again. My husband and I travel with my mother and older sister, both of whom are visiting France for the first time. My son screams for nearly the entirety of the 9 hours from Atlanta to Paris. Our fellow travelers are surprisingly kind about my son's explosion, and I feel it then, in what is possibly the worst travel moment I have ever experienced. Fraternité. Not knowing what he wants or what he needs other than sleep. I feel kindness in the smiles of our fellow travelers that reassure my husband and me in those worst moments when we consider giving our boy away to the first person who asks nicely. Days later, when we are settled into Marseille, and my son and my niece are both asleep, miraculously, I sit with my husband, sister, and brother-in-law on the terrace of their apartment, basking in the Mediterranean sunshine as we look out over the ocean. In that moment, I feel most glad for these families we have created, the ones that we keep trying to bring together as we both travel through the world, feeling our connection to France and each other. My brother-in-law's rosé, bright and sharp, infinitely drinkable, chills in a sweating bottle on the table. I feel this connection to France through language and now through family. But it is not mine, and I cannot claim it. I watch and listen as my sister translates into French an idiomatic American expression for her husband, and remember that there isn't anywhere I can claim, even here, to be at home in the world. Thank you.
All right, it looks like we have about 25 minutes left for questions. So, does anyone have any questions you would like to get started with? Yes, go ahead.
Questions for Anne. So you said you could not find anything other than government documents when you were looking for family history. Was there an oral history that helped you?
No, I mean, the short answer is no. My family didn't do a very good job of documenting our own history, and as I talked to my mom and the people that she knew in the community growing up, that was pretty common. It was a common thing. A lot of the African American families that she knew did not document our own history very well, and the community history obviously was destroyed. There are some things. I started off doing the series as sort of a straight documentary style of recording what I could find. I went to UIC's library, Jane Addams Hull House, which is on the campus of UIC. As an interesting aside, the UIC library is the largest repository of information for the Near West Side, which they in hand played a large role in destroying. And then is a book, Near West Side Stories, so that was a book that I used as a reference. But pretty quick, and it's nothing but oral history, and people from each of those communities. Literally, the chapters are the Italian area, the Black area, and so that was an interesting read. But I was much more interested in the question of why I was interested in this idea of like this nostalgic impulse. Why was I interested in, or thinking that I would find a certain kind of documentation that didn't exist? So I don't want to take all our time.
Other questions? Go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Ambrose. So when you talk about this lady traveling, when she was younger, she was traveling with her mother. Do we have any record of who she might have been traveling with as she grew older and was in her 70s?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll repeat it. So Catherine asked, do we have any record for who Lady Anne might have traveled with? Is that right? When she was younger, like in her teenage years, or in general?
Especially when she was older.
Yeah, older. So that's a very aristocratic thing, right? She probably would have had 20 to 50 servants with her, and she hardly ever mentions them. And in truth, and I sort of had this whole subsection on it, but for time I cut it. But she actually calls them her family. So, and you could imagine having watched Downton Abbey, right? Which is clearly. But that's the cultural, right, access point. So that's a couple hundred years later, but what it does, because of course Downton Abbey is about this moment that Britain needs to transition from this society that has functioned essentially on the 17th century model of these country estates that then are becoming obsolete. And those country estates functioned as little economies. And so that you could imagine living in a house, you do have this very strong connection. And so from her position of privilege, I'm sure she felt comfortable calling them that. But that's it.
This is wonderful to hear about. I love all of your work, and really exciting. And one of the things that, and Lauren, you talked about this specifically, but rememory, and you're all sort of working with the notion of both construction of memory and actual memory, and how those things interact, on a scholarly level, and in terms of nonfiction, and in terms of your art. So that's more of a comment than a question, but what does rememory mean and if Toni Morrison talks about it in terms of dealing with trauma, of course, and trying to deal with and make a usable past that we can sustain ourselves with that. So I don't know if that's part of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I've been reading a lot about the idea of like contemporary art and memory, artists who works exclusively in memory studies. And there's an area on this idea of people who, there's a term for it, but it's essentially people who were born beyond a certain like a period. So for instance, there's the German painter Anselm Kiefer, who was born literally at the very end of World War II, April 1945. And so it's this idea of those who are, I think it's called post-memory, maybe that's it, this idea of people who were born beyond the historical moment that they reference in their work. His work is, at least for the first 20 years or so of his practice, early practice from the 70s through the 90s, was exclusively concerned with the sort of traumatic history of Nazi Germany and so that I thought that was a really interesting sort of concept. How do you how do you reference a period that is something that you didn't live through? And the counter to that, again, as an artist, is someone like Kerry James Marshall, current African American painter, artist, Chicago-based, who was born in 1955. And so all of his work, from the very beginning, he stated emphatically that he will only paint black people, and his paintings of black people are jet black people. So he wholly embodies the idea of black is beautiful in his work. But there's a certain kind of, I mean, he lived through that period. he came of age during the civil rights era. So it means something different for me, born post that period in the 70s. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question at all. But, yes.
Go ahead.
My question is for Dion. I'm wondering what your understanding of being citizen is, if your emotional experience is being without home. The way you ended your talk really hit me in the heart. And then I wondered, what is your understanding of being citizen?
I love having you hear me read, Eva, because you have the best questions always. I think that in some ways I don't have an answer for that because I actually don't feel like I'm a citizen anywhere. I have a Canadian passport, but I haven't lived in Canada in 20 years now. I've never voted in my life because I was too young when I left Canada to vote, and because I've lived in this country so long, I don't feel like I should vote there at this point because it's very removed from what my day-to-day life is like, and I don't feel perhaps I should make decisions for people whose lives are removed from my own. And I can't vote here because I'm not a citizen here. So I think in some ways I don't know what it means to be a citizen. I don't know what it means to feel that connection and that investment in place in the same way. I sort of constantly feel like a visitor everywhere, even for the country where I hold a passport because it's been so very long since I lived there now. So I think that for me, I understand citizenship through the lens I sort of see other people experience it, but in many ways I don't understand it fully and don't have access to it in the same way. I remember one of the very first times I came to the U.S., we were in Atlanta and we visited Stone Mountain and we saw the light show there. And not knowing anything about Stone Mountain and its sort of long history with the Klan, I was like, wow, this is really amazing. These people are really excited about their country. Isn't that interesting? Because even though I think Canadians are patriotic, it's in a different way, and it's quieter, I think, sometimes. And so I think that there's always been something sort of interesting and intriguing to me about patriotism, even as I don't necessarily know that patriotism is a feeling that I have access to.
Go ahead.
I'd like to ask Laura, what do you see as the difference between 17th century women's travel literature and how women write travel literature today?
Marcia just asked a doozy. What's the difference between 17th century travel literature of women and today? Well, I suppose, I'm going to access this historically because that's my default. A few things. One would be tourism. So that tourism doesn't exist in the 17th century in the way that we now think of it. And I think tourism, for all of its faults that we might think of it presently, and I know we've had conversations about this, it does open up a space of access. And so that starts to happen in the very end of the 17th century and into the 18th century for women. In fact, women are one of the most sort of often cited, perhaps because of the novelty of participating in tourism. So I suppose that's one difference. And I do think, especially too from where I come from, technology. So the stagecoach and the train, those kinds of technologies have a tremendous impact on opening up the potential for travel. And so that if we kind of continue that forward, I would liken that to discount airfare, to hostels, to women traveling together, those sorts of things. But like I say, I'm accessing it really just from history and technology, and I wonder if you have thoughts on women today. I mean, you can have thoughts too. No, women in travel.
Well, I agree with you. I think that technology has really opened up travel for women too. I mean, I think that fortunately or unfortunately, it's still been problematic for women to travel on their own and to travel independently because of the world, I guess, is the best sort of answer for that. But I also think that, with technology, with blogs and with travel websites, there's some access of like, well, these are places you want to go and these are places you don't want to go. And I think that probably existed through word of mouth before, but I think it then opens it up to people who may have never traveled or never gone anywhere. You can still sort of get that word of mouth feeling, through the internet or through a website. And so I think technology is absolutely key in terms of the way that women experience travel.
Yeah, and I suppose one thing I'd say that's the same, and I can't shake this, is socioeconomics, right? So that, even at our present moment, there's tremendous privilege in travel, and it's not necessarily just about distance, but it's partially about access to particular technologies, but to those places, and that has always been the case. So if we maybe intersect the gender question with the economics or the social thing, I think that's there too.
Just one thing also I was interested in, and I mean, it's maybe a little bit broader because of my interest or kind of lack thereof in social media in general. But but it seems like in terms of technology, it's made the world. I mean, we always hear it's made the world smaller, and so. I always wonder about how it's affected travel just in general. How much people are invested in the act of literally leaving the place that they are comfortable with. I mean, comfortable in terms of in a virtual bubble, and experiencing and taking chances. And we all talk about kind of generationally, we're pretty much around the same age, and so we talk about other generations who freely traveled throughout Europe and hitchhiked and things like that, or even across the U.S. and how much that's really changed, and for all the reasons that you've mentioned. But I find it kind of just striking how it seems like this social media sort of or technological component has maybe shrunk the world in the sense that people don't necessarily feel that they need to have that experience of travel, which I find kind of troubling a little bit. So, yeah.
And thinking about what you said about tourism too, as a difference too. I mean, I think when people traveled a great distance before, it wasn't a trip you were going. There was a good chance you weren't coming back. And so, it wasn't tourism. It was, well, maybe I'll come back, but there's a good possibility I won't, and thinking about where the stakes then are that much higher, right? And so I think there's probably a history of different people of different classes traveling, but the fact is that if you left home and if you went somewhere, there was a good possibility that if you were of a certain class, you were going for good. When I teach travel writing, the very first question I ask on the first day of class is, how do you plan a trip without a credit card? And then my students stare back at me and go, what?
And I think that's why I keep going back to this crazy trip that we took, because we didn't have credit cards. And I don't know how available that is to your generation. I mean, it really does strike me, that we could go and camp on the sort of side of the road and just use cash and use calling cards and do it. And I don't know. I think about that. But a fun fact about travel in the 17th century and earlier, you took out insurance on yourself because you were most likely not going to make it. So somebody was going to get pay back, right? So that when you died, in your travel, somebody would benefit from that. New definition of travel insurance.
I have a question for you. So one of the things that I found really interesting in sort of navigating the space of constructing memory, recreating memory, creating memory, is the role of material objects and material culture. And so my question is actually for Dion. And I was wondering if you use objects in trying to understand your home and your relationship to your own sort of liminality, because your writing is very descriptive of objects. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to objects.
I've moved a lot, so I don't have, I do have a lot of stuff. I think we all have a lot of stuff. But I don't think I have a lot of sort of like ephemera of my life or my history. One of the things that was really fascinating to me when I first went home with my husband was that we went to this house that his family had lived in for 30 years. And I was like, what? Your family's lived someplace for 30 years? That's crazy. That's a lifetime. So, and then not just that, but there was like all this stuff from his childhood. There were pictures and things that he grew up with. And that to me was like going to a museum of him. And I was like, this is amazing. Your parents curated the space just for you. And so I really, I mean, I'm kind of actually fascinated by other people's stuff, you know, and the fact that you have this collection of stuff that spells out your life and your history. I mean, I don't have that. And I think that, you know, it's like the horrible question I always say to my students, like, well, of course, when you go to a dinner party, you look in somebody's medicine cabinet, right? Like, and see what kind of stuff they have. And they really like writing and they look at me and they're like, absolutely, I do. Or they're like, you're weird and creepy, Dr. Bremeyer. And so, I mean, I think that people's things tell us so much about their life and who they are. And I like the idea of people having this collection of things. I think that for me, it does end up being memories, and I think memory is inherently flawed. I mean, I think memory is fiction. I think that you can tell a story and no two people will tell it the same way. So I feel like in some way I like the idea of having these objects that sort of indicate, you know, a life and a place and a space, because I think sometimes it becomes so subjective when I think about my story and my family and my place, that's really this sort of weird collection of memories. And I like documents. You know, I'm fascinated by Ian's work. I love the idea of like, I'm like, ooh, a death certificate? That might have some interesting information on it, because even things like that, you know. And as I mentioned in my essay, you know, when my father died, it was the first time I had seen my grandparents' names. It was the first time I had seen where my father was born. It was the first time I had even seen a picture of my father from before he met my mother, which he was almost 30 at that point. I had no idea what he even looked like before that time. So I love the idea of stuff in a way, even though I don't have much stuff.
We have time for one last question.
Okay.
Oh, unless Ian wants to. Go ahead, sorry.
I can make it really quick. I mean, I thought that was a really great question. And I mean, for me, you know, I talked a little bit about objects and object theory and this idea that objects have an inherent sort of history behind them. And I'll admit that I've watched, you know, many episodes of Hoarders, and I'm fascinated by that, because I'm fascinated by the sheer amount of stuff that people accumulate over time, but also obviously because there are issues with the people, but in the sense that their collection is connected to generally some sort of trauma that's related, but I find that just really fascinating, this idea of objects carrying history and stuff, and generally for me at least, sort of ephemeral objects, things that don't have, usually they don't have, you know, like like a hard sort of like value to them. They're disposable, tickets for like travel, things like that, or receipts or whatever, the kind of casual thing, or documents that are just like a birth certificate or whatever. But the collection of that stuff, how they come together and form a history, and then for me at least, the manipulation of that and how you can tell a story about the construction of memory and history by the collection and the construction and the piecing together of things that may not have ever existed. So.
One more quick question, if anyone has. All right, I'd like to thank all three of our presenters today for really fascinating presentations. And I think we have a short break.
My name is Dr. Laura Klepper. I am a bioacoustician here at the biology department at St. Mary's College, and I would like to tell you about some really cool research I did with my students this summer. So I study biosonar, which is echolocation in animals. Bats and dolphins both use biosonar. And these animals have been studied for decades to try to better improve man-made sonar. And I study these bats in these really large caves because everything that we know right now about biology and math tells us that they shouldn't be able to echolocate when they're in these really large groups. So that means that we're missing something. So this summer I took 2 students on an 8-week cross-country road trip as we traveled across the Southwest to 9 different bat caves. We went to these different caves to study the echolocation, or the biosonar, of bats when they're leaving from these really large cave colonies. And by better understanding how the bats are using their sonar, we can better improve our man-made sonar devices.
For this research project, I'm studying Mexican free-tailed bats and how environmental factors affect their emergence time. Emergence time will affect their foraging time, which foraging time is the time they have to eat and gather their food. So if they have less time to forage, then they'll eventually starve.
My role this summer in our research will be analyzing data, helping set up microphones in the GoPros. When bats emerge from their caves, they come out in varying densities, and I want to see how their echolocation, which helps them navigate, how that changes as well.
The students far exceeded my expectations of what I was hoping we would accomplish this summer. I told them at the end of the summer that the research they were doing far surpassed that of a master's level research program, and I was so impressed by the work that they had done. It's highly unusual across other institutions that students, undergraduate students, get to do research of this level. But here at St. Mary's, it's actually quite common. That's one of the things that makes St. Mary's so unique, is that students are so strong and the student-professor relationship is so great. They have the opportunity to do this kind of work with professors.
My name is Annie Cavalier. I am from Youngstown, Ohio. I'm a senior here at St. Mary's. Chemistry major, biology minor. My goal is to go on after I graduate, get my medical degree and my PhD. Here, there's so many women in science, and there's so many women that are doing amazing things after they leave St. Mary's. That's all due to the fact that we're empowered every day to go out and do whatever we want to do.
Hi, my name is Catherine Marshall, and I'd like to tell you about the research I did this past summer. This summer, Dr. Ralston and I spent a week in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We were out in the field mist netting some birds, which is the method of catching birds. They're these giant thin nets that the bird will fly into, get slightly tangled up, and we extract the bird. I usually take a blood sample, I band the bird, we'll take its weight measurements, its beak length, and let it fly away. And this sort of method is a great way to really get some hands-on contact with a live bird instead of a specimen per se. It's also a great way for me to learn about the different species that are out there.
Birds are really good model organisms to study for lots of different ecological reasons. Birds are good what we call indicator species. Because it's relatively easy to go out in the field and to observe a bird relative to other types of species, they're often used as this indicator of things that might be going on in the environment. And so birds have this history of study to detect things like climate change or other types of environmental disturbances. And so we study birds to see how their distributions are changing and what that might mean about climate change and all species in the environment. I think research is, first of all, the best teaching tool. It really teaches students what biology is, but also importantly, it teaches them what it would be like to be a biologist.
I love the biology department because it's a great community. I love seeing what my fellow Bells are researching. I love interacting with a variety of professors in different courses. I love that we have our biology comp, which seems a little bit intimidating, but it's like a giant science fair project. And at the end of the year, we have Bell Biology Day, where everyone is presenting their research, and we're all just so proud of each other and so interested in what we are doing. We're not alone in this journey into the crazy science world, but we're all women in science, and we're all ready to go out there and make a difference.
My name is Michelle Espinal. I'm from Chinandega, Nicaragua. That's in Central America. My current major here at St. Mary's is mathematics. And then I'm a civil engineer at Notre Dame. One of the reasons why I chose civil engineering is because you help people. You use your major to, help people and work with them, and at the same time, it sounds cliche, but you make a better world for someone else besides yourself. The project that I worked with this past summer, we planned, designed, fundraised, and then built a footbridge in a community in Nicaragua that was not able to cross the river during rainy season because it floods. The river was so dangerous. We have the middle school is on the other side of the river. They are going to school. It's kids. And that's a huge risk because mothers would tie ropes to them in order to cross them to the other side safely. That was just really sad to hear that they had to put all of that effort in order to do something that we do every day. The building of the footbridge, that was intense. That's the word that defines it. Just picture engineering student my age digging excavations, picking up buckets full of gravel, full of sand, full of cement, getting dirty every single day, working from 5 in the morning till 9 p.m. The day the bridge was completed was amazing. Everyone celebrated. And after we were done, all of my classmates and I would just lay on the bridge for a solid 2 hours, and we're just like, wow, we're done. This just happened. That was the biggest engineering challenge. The classes that I've taken here, they have opened my mind in a way that I cannot believe.
Four of us went to Chirisozi, Uganda, on the western side of the country. I'm an education major, so I taught there, and we also had 2 nurses and 1 communicative disorders major. Well, it's definitely a harder lifestyle, but it's a slower one, more relaxed, and it's very community-based.
It was very green, actually, very lush, and we lived with the sisters in the convent. I was serving in a clinic. We saw a lot of different problems. The majority of the patients that came in were kids and they had malaria. And we also saw pregnant women. There was an antenatal clinic there. A team of us went out to some schools and we did immunizations. And we did up to 100 immunizations probably each time we went.
There are many things you can, but there are little things you can do.
And through that, we kind of were able to bond with them and gain their trust.
I taught in the 2nd grade classroom in the mornings, and then I would do various reading workshops in the 4th and 5th grade classrooms in the afternoon. Can't tell you how many times I walked in and they said, "Teacher, teach us something." And they're so happy to learn. They're amazed by us 4 American girls. They loved us from the first day.
So the paper analytical device project, both at St. Mary's and at Notre Dame, our concern is whether people are getting high quality, I mean good quality pharmaceuticals, so medicines.
These low-quality pharmaceutical drugs have become rampant in a lot of developing countries in the world, a lot of developing areas. So as you can imagine, these counterfeit drugs cause a lot of issues and health hazards for the people in these areas. So a PAD, which is a paper analytical device, that's our solution to this problem. It's about the size of a business card, and basically it's a small device that anybody can use anywhere to quickly detect if a pharmaceutical drug may be low quality or if it has contaminants or hazardous material in it.
Pharmaceuticals from India and China tend to be more suspect according to the literature. And Nepal is literally between China to the north and India to the south. We had been doing lots of laboratory work, but I owed it to the project and to the students to go out into the field, into the developing country to test these pads. So Nepal was it.
You know, as a researcher in the PADS project, it's really important when we go to these countries, when I went to Tanzania or Nepal, to really go with an understanding that I'm not going there to be a fix-all for these people, right? I don't hold all the answers. We need to learn from each other. They were beautiful people. They were so friendly, so welcoming, so wonderful. So these people in these developing areas that are facing issues of low-quality pharmaceutical drugs, the goal of the PADS project would allow these people to have access to the pad and to be able to test their pharmaceutical drugs before they use them to ensure that they're safe and that they are in fact what the pharmaceutical drug says it is.
The students involved with the St. Mary's PADS project have truly taken ownership. They want to use their skills, okay? They want to use their skills, their spiritual beliefs and so forth to do good in the world. Just touching that pulse of excitement of the students as they're developing, as they're coming into their own, is incredibly exciting for me. For the students, they find it a significant and valuable experience to not only get undergraduate research experience, but to do it on a project that they can see such good coming out.
That's what I think the PADS project was for me. It was taking a problem that I saw in real life in Tanzania, in Nepal, and then being able to become involved in how can we fix that? How can we help these people? So it becomes like personal when you really, it's like your story, you know?
That's what's special about the St. Mary's students, and everyone who's been involved with the PADS project has been an incredible contributor.
The PADS project is the real world, right? I mean, it's using scientific research to try to help people in a really practical and real way, which I just think is awesome. I think it's really St. Mary's, you know, like science and research meets compassion and the real world. I think it's awesome.
We just feel that this has been a very blessed project and that this is in line with the Sisters of the Holy Cross, with the mission of this college, with our internal missions, that we're just blessed.
My name is Dr. Laura Klepper. I am a bioacoustician here at the biology department at St. Mary's College, and I would like to tell you about some really cool research I did with my students this summer. So I study biosonar, which is echolocation in animals. Bats and dolphins both use biosonar. And these animals have been studied for decades to try to better improve man-made sonar. And I study these bats in these really large caves because everything that we know right now about biology and math tells us that they shouldn't be able to echolocate when they're in these really large groups. So that means that we're missing something. So this summer I took 2 students on an 8-week cross-country road trip as we traveled across the Southwest to 9 different bat caves. We went to these different caves to study the echolocation, or the biosonar, of bats when they're leaving from these really large cave colonies. And by better understanding how the bats are using their sonar, we can better improve our man-made sonar devices.
For this research project, I'm studying Mexican free-tailed bats and how environmental factors affect their emergence time. Emergence time will affect their foraging time, which foraging time is the time they have to eat and gather their food. So if they have less time to forage, then they'll eventually starve.
My role this summer in our research will be analyzing data, helping set up microphones in the GoPros. When bats emerge from their caves, they come out in varying densities, and I want to see how their echolocation, which helps them navigate, how that changes as well. The students far exceeded my expectations of what I was hoping we would accomplish this summer. I told them at the end of the summer that the research they were doing far surpassed that of a master's level research program, and I was so impressed by the work that they had done. It's highly unusual across other institutions that undergraduate students get to do research of this level. But here at St. Mary's, it's actually quite common. That's one of the things that makes St. Mary's so unique, is that students are so strong and the student-professor relationship is so great. They have the opportunity to do this kind of work with professors.
My name is Annie Cavalier. I am from Youngstown, Ohio. I'm a senior here at St. Mary's. Chemistry major, biology minor. My goal is to go on after I graduate, get my medical degree and my PhD. Here there's so many women in science, and there's so many women that are doing amazing things after they leave St. Mary's. That's all due to the fact that we're empowered every day to go out and do whatever we want to do.
Hi, my name is Catherine Marshall, and I'd like to tell you about the research I did this past summer. This summer, Dr. Ralston and I spent a week in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We were out in the field mist netting some birds, which is the method of catching birds. They're these giant thin nets that the bird will fly into, get slightly tangled up, and we extract the bird. I usually take a blood sample, I band the bird, we'll take its weight measurements, its beak length, and let it fly away. And this sort of method is a great way to really get some hands-on contact with a live bird instead of a specimen per se. It's also a great way for me to learn about the different species that are out there.
Birds are really good model organisms to study for lots of different ecological reasons. Birds are good, what we call indicator species. Because it's relatively easy to go out into the field and to observe a bird relative to other types of species, they're often used as this indicator of things that might be going on in the environment. And so birds have this history of study to detect things like climate change or other types of environmental disturbances. And so we study birds to see how their distributions are changing and what that might mean about climate change and all species in the environment. I think research is, first of all, the best teaching tool. It really teaches students what biology is, but also importantly, it teaches them what it would be like to be a biologist.
I love the biology department because it's a great community. I love seeing what my fellow Bells are researching. I love interacting with a variety of professors in different courses. I love that we have our biology comp, which seems a little bit intimidating, but it's like a giant science fair project. And at the end of the year, we have Bell Biology Day, where everyone is presenting their research, and we're all just so proud of each other and so interested in what we are doing. We're not alone in this journey into the crazy science world, but we're all women in science, and we're all ready to go out there and make a difference.
My name is Michelle Espinal. I'm from Chinandega, Nicaragua. That's in Central America. My current major here at St. Mary's is mathematics. And then I'm a civil engineer at Notre Dame. One of the reasons why I chose civil engineering is because you help people. You use your major to, help people and work with them, and at the same time, it sounds cliche, but you make a better world for someone else besides yourself. The project that I worked with this past summer, we planned, designed, fundraised, and then built a footbridge in a community in Nicaragua that was not able to cross the river during rainy season because it floods. The river was so dangerous. We have the middle school is on the other side of the river. They are going to school. It's kids. And that's a huge risk because mothers would tie ropes to them in order to cross them to the other side safely. That was just really sad to hear that they had to put all of that effort in order to do something that we do every day. The building of the footbridge, that was intense. That's the word that defines it. Just picture engineering student my age digging excavations, picking up buckets full of gravel, full of sand, full of cement, getting dirty every single day, working from 5 in the morning till 9 p.m. The day the bridge was completed was amazing. Everyone celebrated. And after we were done, all of my classmates and I would just lay on the bridge for a solid 2 hours, and we were just like, wow, we're done. This just happened. That was the biggest engineering challenge. The classes that I've taken here, they have opened my mind in a way that I cannot believe.
Four of us went to Chirisozi, Uganda, on the western side of the country. I'm an education major, so I taught there, and we also had 2 nurses and 1 communicative disorders major. It's definitely a harder lifestyle, but it's a slower one, more relaxed, and it's very community-based.
It was very green, actually, very lush, and we lived with the sisters in the convent. I was serving in a clinic. We saw a lot of different problems. The majority of the patients that came in were kids, and they had malaria. And we also saw pregnant women. There was an antenatal clinic there. A team of us went out to some schools and we did immunizations. And we did up to 100 immunizations probably each time we went.
There are many things you can, but there are little things you can do.
And through that, we kind of were able to bond with them and gain their trust.
I taught in the 2nd grade classroom in the mornings, and then I would do various reading workshops in the 4th and 5th grade classrooms in the afternoon. can't tell you how many times I walked in and they said, "Teacher, teach us something." And they're so happy to learn. They're amazed by us 4 American girls. They loved us from the first day.
So the paper analytical device project, both at St. Mary's and at Notre Dame, our concern is whether people are getting high quality, meaning good quality pharmaceuticals, so medicines.
So these low quality pharmaceutical drugs have become rampant in a lot of developing countries in the world, a lot of developing areas. So as you can imagine, these counterfeit drugs cause a lot of issues and health hazards for the people in these areas. So a PAD, which is a paper analytical device, that's our solution to this problem. It's about the size of a business card, and basically it's a small device that anybody can use anywhere to quickly detect if a pharmaceutical drug may be low quality or if it has contaminants or hazardous material in it.
Pharmaceuticals from India and China tend to be more suspect according to the literature. And Nepal is literally between China to the north and India to the south. We had been doing lots of laboratory work, but I owed it to the project and to the students to go out into the field, into the developing country to test these pads. So Nepal was it.
You know, as a researcher in the PADS project, it's really important when we go to these countries, when I went to Tanzania or Nepal, to really go with an understanding that I'm not going there to be a fix-all for these people, right? I don't hold all the answers. We need to learn from each other. They were beautiful people. They were so friendly, so welcoming, so wonderful. So these people in these developing areas that are facing issues of low quality pharmaceutical drugs, the goal of the PADS project would allow these people to have access to the pad and to be able to test their pharmaceutical drugs before they use them to ensure that they're safe and that they are in fact what the pharmaceutical drug says it is.
The students involved with the St. Mary's PADS project have truly taken ownership. They want to use their skills, okay? They want to use their skills, their spiritual beliefs and so forth to do good in the world. Just touching that pulse of excitement of the students as they're developing, as they're coming into their own, is incredibly exciting for me. For the students, they find it a significant and valuable experience to not only get undergraduate research experience, but to do it on a project that they can see such good coming out.
That's what I think the PADS project was for me. It was taking a problem that I saw in real life in Tanzania, in Nepal, and then being able to become involved in how can we fix that? How can we help these people? So it becomes like personal when you really, it's like your story, you know?
That's what's special about the St. Mary's students, and everyone who's been involved with the PADS project has been an incredible contributor.
The PADS project is the real world, right? I mean, it's using scientific research to try to help people in a really practical and real way, which I just think is awesome. I think it's really St. Mary's, you know, like science and research meets compassion and the real world. I think it's awesome.
We just feel that this has been a very blessed project and that this is in line with the Sisters of the Holy Cross, with the mission of this college, with our internal missions, that we're just blessed.
My name is Dr. Laura Klepper. I am a bioacoustician here at the biology department at St. Mary's College, and I would like to tell you about some really cool research I did with my students this summer. So I study biosonar, which is echolocation in animals. Bats and dolphins both use biosonar. And these animals have been studied for decades to try to better improve man-made sonar. And I study these bats in these really large caves because everything that we know right now
So we can go to the poster session, which I think will be amazing, at 4 o'clock. So our first speaker is Dr. Catherine Haas, and the title of her talk is Memory Metals, the Strange Case of Copper in the Human Brain. And Dr. Haas she's an assistant professor in chemistry, and she's been a faculty member here since 2012. Her research group that she runs out of the Department of Chemistry focuses on using chemistry as a tool to solve problems in biology with a specific focus on the role of metal ions in human health and disease. She's received a 2016 Cottrell Scholar Award from the Research Corporation for Science Advancement in recognition of her excellence in teaching and undergraduate research. And she's also supported by the National Science Foundation for collaborative work she's been doing on improving ethics training for students in science and engineering classes. So I will turn the podium over to Dr. Haas.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here today, and I want to say a special thank you to Laura Ambrose for organizing an excellent 2 panels. Yes, thank you, Laura. So I want to talk to you today about one of the projects in my research lab at St. Mary's College. This is an undergraduate research project, which means that undergraduates do all of the research in collaboration with some of our collaborators at other institutions. And we work, one of the projects we work on is related to the role of copper in Alzheimer's disease. So I'm talking about this project today because of the memory theme. I'm a bioinorganic chemist, which means that I'm very interested in the roles of metal ions in biology. And this is kind of a conundrum because for a very long time, scientists didn't think that metal ions or metal elements were important in biology at all. So the elements that are metals, just in case you don't know, are the ones that are outlined in yellow here, and they cover most of the periodic table. Now, it's only about the last 50 years that we've known that most of these elements that are in the top row of the kind of this funny zone in the middle, those are very interesting elements. They're essential for biological systems, and many of them are essential for health, for human health, that is. So we've only known this for about 50 years. And in the last 50 years, we've realized that all of these metal ions play many different roles along a spectrum of roles in human health. So the ones like manganese, iron, cobalt, nickel, and copper are essential, but there are ones that can also be toxic or that can cause disease. And then there are other ones that are actually really important for medicine, even though they're not essential for our health normally. So my lab is really interested in copper. And copper is my favorite element because it plays different roles all along this spectrum. And its really interesting chemistry allows it to be both essential and toxic and potentially cause disease all at the same time. And it's the special ability of copper to change its state from a +1 oxidation state or a +1 state, I call that copper 1, to a +2 or copper 2 oxidation state. So its ability to go back and forth between these two states is really special. It allows copper to participate in essential electron transport reactions in biology. And this special chemistry is called redox chemistry. So redox chemistry is really good. It's important. This is why copper is essential. It's essential for basic processes in the cell, like producing energy or antioxidant activity. Things like complete systemic functions like brain function or neurological function. But if this redox chemistry is not properly controlled, it can also be very bad. It can cause a lot of damage. It can cause things like premature aging, degeneration of tissues, and it can cause the onset of disease. And most of these mechanisms are through oxidative stress. So this redox chemistry of copper, if it's not properly controlled, it can actually cause oxidative stress, which is a bad thing. And you probably already know about oxidative stress because this is actually why you eat antioxidants or take antioxidants in your body to get rid of this problem. So copper is a paradox here because not only can it make the oxidative stress, but if it's properly regulated, it can take away the oxidative stress because it is an antioxidant. So the way that copper is handled in your body is absolutely essential so that copper is doing good redox, but not the bad redox. And there's evidence that when copper is dysregulated in your body, it can actually cause Alzheimer's disease. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Alzheimer's disease. It is a major social and economic problem, and it's caused by neurodegeneration or atrophy of the brain. So here I have two brains. One is a normal aged brain, and that's on the left-hand side. And my Alzheimer's disease brain on the right is obviously smaller. Now, it's important to know that the onset of Alzheimer's disease is actually not part of normal aging. This is actually a disease state because these brains are the same age. You can see in the bottom picture that the Alzheimer's disease brain is eroding in the areas of the brain that are associated with memory and language, and that's why the first symptoms of Alzheimer's disease are loss of memory and trouble communicating. Now, the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, and the thing that we think is actually causing Alzheimer's disease, is something called amyloid beta plaques. This is something that's unique to Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't appear in other dementias. So amyloid beta plaques are shown here in this little figure. This is a piece of brain tissue that's been stained, and the brown areas are amyloid beta plaques. So the other thing about Alzheimer's disease, we see these amyloid beta plaques. Well, first I should say the amyloid beta plaques are actually blocking neuronal connections or communication between the nerves, and that's there's a hypothesis that that's what's causing the brain to degenerate. So if you stop nerves from communicating, since nerves are use it or lose it kind of thing, those will die if they stop talking to one another. So amyloid beta may be just causing the disease, but there's also an increase in oxidative stress. So this is where copper comes along, because we know that copper can cause oxidative stress, and in fact, there's an increase in copper in the brain of an Alzheimer's disease patient compared to the normal patient. And so there's a hypothesis that copper can actually be involved in this process. So we need to know a little bit about what amyloid beta plaques are. So amyloid beta plaques are actually an aggregated or clumped up form of a protein called amyloid beta. And amyloid beta is present in healthy brains. So it's something called a peptide, which is just a short piece of a protein. And it's only in the case of Alzheimer's disease that these proteins clump together and form kind of globs that block nerves from communicating. So the observation that these plaques only form in Alzheimer's disease has led to the hypothesis that the amyloid beta plaques can actually cause the disease. But there's another thing, and this is kind of a chemist's point of view of this situation. If you take amyloid beta in a test tube and you add copper, the plaques form immediately, and they form to a larger extent than if the copper wasn't there. And in the test tube, you can generate oxidative stress with these copper-loaded plaques. And this is kind of exactly the same thing that we're seeing in the real situation, where you have plaques forming, you have increase in oxidative stress, and those plaques are loaded with copper. Now, to understand the disease state, and I will say we do not understand Alzheimer's disease, it is a big puzzle. But to understand that disease state, we might need to know some things about the healthy state, and we actually don't know very much about that. And so there's a lot that we don't know about the role of amyloid beta in healthy brains, but we do know a little bit about what copper's doing. So copper is actually used by cells to mediate neurotransmission. So this is a picture of a synapse. It's basically two nerves coming together and communicating through chemical signals. So if you imagine the top nerve here is sending a chemical signal across this gap, which is the synapse, and then the chemical signal reaches the bottom nerve, and you can think of it as a little tickle, and the copper is basically tickling that nerve so that it sends a signal down to the next nerve. Well, then the copper needs to be taken back up into the first cell, or it needs to be cleared from the synapse in some way in order for the signal to stop. And this happens very quickly and regularly. It's happening in your brain and in any of your motor neurons right now. So we know that copper is in the synapse, and we also know that amyloid beta is in the synapse. But the weird part is, like, we don't know what this amyloid beta is doing. All of us right now have copper and amyloid beta in our brains, but not everybody's getting Alzheimer's disease. So there's a flaw in the hypothesis that just copper plus amyloid beta gives you Alzheimer's. So we don't understand. Part of the problem is we don't understand what these are doing. There's also a protein that I'm very interested in on the cell surface, and this protein is the one that takes copper back up into cells so that you clear the copper from the synapse. That's called the copper transporter 1, and I abbreviate it with CTR1. So here are two proteins that amyloid beta, we know it binds to copper, and we just don't know what it's doing. And then CTR1 is the copper transporter. So both of these proteins must be doing something, interacting with copper and controlling its redox. And my lab is really interested in knowing how they're doing that. So these are two big pieces of the puzzle of Alzheimer's disease, or in healthy brains, basically, that we are trying to solve in my research group. So my main focus is CTR1, this copper transporter. So on the top of this figure, you have the outside of the cell, and on the bottom is the inside. In the middle is the cellular membrane. And the job of this protein is to take copper into the cell. But it only will transport copper 1. And since copper is always copper 2 on the outside of the cell, there has to be a redox change in order for this to happen. So this protein must be controlling that redox change, and it must be preventing damage from happening, or this bad redox. And we want to know how it's doing that. And so we actually just study the very tippy top of this protein, just a small piece of it. Let's see if my animation works. Oop. Hold on, let me go back. Okay, so we study just this one little piece. And here is the amino acid sequence. So this is actually a picture of all of the amino acids. And you can think of these as they're protein building blocks, and they're like charms on a charm bracelet, or beads on a necklace, where each one of them is unique and special. So here's the letter abbreviation for each of these amino acids, and we study just this tiny little region of the protein because we've discovered that it has really special ability to handle copper. So it's actually these histidine, or H amino acids. I've shown them here in blue, and you can see them up above in the letter code. These histidines are especially good at binding to copper, and the pattern of this particular sequence is really important. So whenever you have a histidine, or an H, in the third position from the end, that's a really special copper 2 binding site. It will only bind to copper 2. And then next door, this protein also has a bis-his, or an HH site. And this particular site is really great at binding to copper 1, but it will only bind to copper 1. And we found that this protein, having those two sequences right there, the copper 2 binding site right next to the copper binding site, what will happen is the protein will actually bind to copper 2, and then it will allow the redox change to happen in a very protective way using these amino acids. So we've been studying this type of sequence for quite a while, and what we did is we looked at amyloid beta, and this is actually the sequence of the amyloid beta peptide that's present in healthy brains. There's actually many different forms of amyloid beta, but this is the one that's present in healthy brains, and we found this one particularly interesting because we saw some familiar patterns. So remember that the histidine in the third position is a copper 2 binding site. You see that in amyloid beta. And the two histidines right next to each other is the copper 1 binding site, and we also see that in amyloid beta. But there's a difference between these proteins, and the difference is the spacing between them. So this is the kind of stuff that we do in our lab. We look at these proteins and we say, wow, cool. I wonder if, what happens if you change the spacing in CTR1? Can you change its chemistry? And in fact, I had a student who asked that question. She was the first research student that worked with me when I came to St. Mary's. She asked that very same question. She said, okay, well, what if you change the spacing in CTR1? We had well characterized CTR1 at this point. So like, could we change the chemistry if we just change the spacing? So she made a series of peptides, which are shown here on the slide, with different spacing between the copper 2 binding site and the copper 1 binding site. And she did a simple assay to test for copper redox chemistry. And I don't need to explain much about this assay for you to see that these things behave very differently. And so what we found is that by changing the spacing between the copper 2 binding site and the copper 1 binding site, you can go from safe copper redox to bad or dangerous copper redox. And if you look down at the very bottom, you'll see a very big hump that's around 400 nanometers, and that really big hump is indicative of oxidative stress forming. So we recognize that now as oxidative stress, whereas some of the other ones don't do that at all. So she published this work in Journal of Inorganic Biochemistry last year, and she's actually now a graduate student at Purdue. But we also, we looked at this and we said, okay, there's some spacing here that's really interesting, but amyloid beta has different spacing and it also has different amino acids. What happens under the same conditions with amyloid beta? So if you compare the CTR1 with the same type of assay, you can see that they're also different. And what this data tells us is that CTR1, like we already knew, is allowing copper to change its oxidation state in a very controlled, safe way, whereas amyloid beta doesn't allow copper to change at all. Nothing is happening there. And so now we think that this particular form of amyloid beta is actually protecting the brain against redox chemistry. So we're now asking this question, which is how do amyloid beta and CTR1 work together to protect the brain against oxidative damage or copper-induced damage? And we're working with a lab in Poland to work on, to try to answer this question. So I spent 8 weeks last summer working in Poland with the BAO lab. They're experts in amyloid beta chemistry, and I'm an expert in the CTR1 chemistry. And this summer, Evelina, who is the girl in red, will be coming to St. Mary's to continue the research project that we started together while I was in Poland. We're still working on CTR1 as well and trying to understand its sequence. And we've been tipped off by a biologist who also works on CTR1 that there were some really interesting other amino acids in the sequence, like the methionines, the aspartic acids, and even glycines. These are amino acids that don't ever touch copper in these binding sites, but they seem to really change the activity of the protein when you change those amino acids. And so we actually are introducing this type of research into chemistry courses at St. Mary's. This is a picture from the fall 2016 rendition of Chem 361, which Dr. Fishovitz, who blends in with the students really well, she's right there, and I have nicknamed ProLab. So we're trying to encourage the students to learn about science through research and to be proactive, professional, productive scientists. And so that's all I have to say, except for I should say thank you to a lot of people. First of all, our funders. There are a lot of people on this list. There's alumni. There's a lot of St. Mary's College money. It's really been absolutely essential for us to be able to do this research, and it's allowed us to roll this into National Science Foundation grants and Research Corporation for Science Advancement grants. Our collaborators are excellent. In fact, one of our collaborators, Jake Pushy, will be traveling to Stanford with us this summer with some students, and we're going to collect some more data on some of the really high technology spectroscopic equipment at Stanford, and then the St. Mary's students, of course, who pour their hearts into a lot of these projects. So thank you for your attention. Before I go, I'll also mention that Emma Bridgman is giving a poster later on a very, very similar topic. So I hope you stop by her poster. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next presenter is Dr. Terry Abelie-Futch, and I'm just gonna pull that one down and pull this one up. Here we go. So Dr. Abelie-Futch is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. She has a PhD in neuroscience. Her research focuses on how hormones and neurotransmitters interact to produce complex behaviors such as mating, decision-making, and the ability to pay attention. So she's been here at St. Mary's for 3 years, and I'd like to mention that during that time, She and Dr. Roselle, who will come up next, have also been working on creating a neuroscience program here at St. Mary's. So I'll turn things over to Dr. Avalie Futch.
Thanks, Bettina. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? You're all right? Okay. So I'm also going to be talking about the brain, but a different part of the brain. I'm going to be talking about learning without doing, so the ability to learn how to do something without ever practicing it before, which is something that we see in the animal model that I use. So I'll be talking to you about that. So the nose knows the effects of exposure to female scents on the sexual behavior of naive male rats. So we will be talking about rats mating today. So bear with me. There's actually a lot of research done on female sexual behavior, but not a lot done on male sexual behavior. It was basically thought for a long time that male sexual behavior was very straightforward. Males have a very specific goal in mind when they go about mating, but it turns out that there's a lot more to it than you might think. And for males and females, sex behavior is divided into two stages. Oops, wrong button. The first stage being the appetitive stage, which is sexual interest, sexual arousal, wanting to engage in sexual acts, and then what's known as the consumatory phase, which is the actual completion of the sex act. I'll be talking about the consumatory phase today. I'm also interested in the appetitive stage as well, but that's a different line of research. So we'll be talking about the actual completion of the sex act today. I'll say the word sex a lot. In front of my students, I just come up and I say, sex, sex, sex. We're good. And then we just keep going. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how sex works in the brain. So what parts of the brain are needed to actually perform sexual behavior. And then I'll talk about some of the chemistry, like Dr. Haas did, talking about what needs to happen a little more physiologically. There are a few brain areas, and I'll just pop up this picture so you can see too. There's a lot going on. You would probably think it wouldn't be this complicated, but there are quite a few brain areas that are involved to actually complete a mating act. But the most important one is the one in red right here. It's called the medial preoptic area, or the MPOA. So that name just means medial, means in the middle. So it's right on the midline. This little arrow, this little line here is kind of pointing to it. Preoptic just means that it's right in front of an area called the optic chiasm, which is where your optic nerves cross. And it's an area because it's not very well defined. There's not a specific nucleus for it. But it's required for all consumatory sex behaviors. If this area is damaged, the animal cannot have sex. They're not even interested. Basically, they become like an asexual creature. So it's well known that that is sort of the most important area. And interestingly, for our talk, and especially in rats, though this does have corollary in humans, inputs from the olfactory bulb, which is OB up here, they go to the MPOA, they go sideways, so they go through another area called the amygdala first. But then they get there, and smell is very important in rat sexual behavior. They need to be able to smell their mate in order to complete the act. So it's needed to initiate. If you block the nose of a male rat and he can't smell the female, he will not be interested. He will not try to mate with her. So it's needed in order to sort of begin. And so I'll be talking about sort of the perception aspect of what we're talking about today. And so a little bit of the chemistry of the brain. There's this neurotransmitter called dopamine. You may or may not have heard of it before. It's a neurotransmitter that's implicated a lot in sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. If you're interested in something, chocolate, whatever, you're going to get a rush of dopamine. And dopamine is important for sex, too, as in the sex, drugs, and rock and roll name. And it's critical for copulation. What you're seeing in this graph here is BL means baseline. So that's before the animals start to copulate, if you were measuring this inside the male rat's brain. This pre down here is when he's introduced to the female. So the female gets in the male's cage, and you'll see a white circle here is the amount of dopamine. So it increases almost immediately as soon as he starts smelling her. It stays high throughout the mating session. This C1, C2, C3 are different mating sessions. And then as the female is taken away this post, it starts to go down. And if you block the dopamine, if you prevent this release, the animal doesn't copulate. Again, they just kind of sit there like they're not interested at all in the female. So If dopamine is not released within this critical brain area, again, animals don't copulate. And if you give a drug to block it, same thing, they don't copulate. So it's really important and necessary for this neurotransmitter to be in the area. And the release of dopamine is very highly regulated by the brain. We release dopamine when something is good, something we want to pay attention to, when something that we want to pursue. We don't want it to be released when something bad is happening. So it's very highly controlled. And one of the things that control it is something you might not have heard of before or thought of. It's a gas, nitric oxide. So this is not nitrous oxide, which is what you inhale at the dentist's office. Nitric oxide, NO, is a gas, and we don't think of gases being in our brain, but we have a lot of them that are released at very specific times. Carbon monoxide is another one, that's the thing that can kill you. We have it in very small amounts in our brain, too, to be released at specific times. So it's found inside of the body, it's found inside of the brain. It's been well known, and I have this picture over here, for some time that it affects our blood system in particular. It helps dilate blood vessels. It helps platelets not form, so if you don't want to have a blood clot. And pharmaceuticals such as Viagra use nitric oxide stimulators as active ingredients for the dilation properties. So one of the reasons that Viagra works is it helps to dilate blood vessels, so all the blood is going where you need it to go. However, in the brain, it's doing something a little bit differently. It's used as what's called a non-traditional neurotransmitter. Because it's a gas, if I just put it in your brain, it would go everywhere. It doesn't follow the rules of normal neurotransmitters. So what happens is that it's made on demand. There's a little enzyme. You have the nitrogen and the oxygen, and they come together at the right moment. It's released sort of in the general area where you need it to be released, and then it's broken down again very quickly. So that's not how normal neurotransmitters work. But it does work for this particular gas. And it's found, the enzyme to create it, I have, it's a little bit of a misnomer, it is found, but the enzyme to create the nitric oxide on demand is found in the dopamine cells. And the dopamine cells need the nitric oxide to release dopamine, or it facilitates the release. So more dopamine is released in the presence of nitric oxide than would be released if it was not there. And so this has been known for quite some time, but it was sort of unclear what nitric oxide was doing. There was sort of this basic model of mating behavior. And what some individuals from my postdoctoral laboratory did, starting in the 90s and working on up, was they found that it interacted with the dopamine system by increasing dopamine release. So without it, you'll still release dopamine. But with it, you'll release a lot more, more than you would in sort of normal circumstances. And we found in my postdoctoral lab that administration of a pharmaceutical that increases nitric oxide, basically that enhances that enzyme, it helps you make more, also facilitates sexual behavior, similarly to giving a pharmaceutical that increases dopamine. And what the graph over here is just showing is this is dopamine release sort of in a normal animal when they're mating, and getting these measurements while rats are mating is really fun. And this is an animal where we block nitric oxide. So you can give a drug that prevents the nitric oxide from being formed, that it stops that enzyme from working, and much less dopamine is released. There's still some, and the mating behavior is concordantly bad. The animal might try to mate, but usually is not successful. And here, this is a drug that increases dopamine, so that when you give this, you give a dopamine drug, and it pops back up to near normal levels. And this is a drug that increases just the nitric oxide and not the dopamine. So if you give a dopamine-enhancing drug or a nitric oxide-enhancing drug, you get about the same increase in dopamine and an increase in sexual behavior, too. So we have this sort of basic model, if you will, that we know this brain area is important for sex. You need it to be intact. And we know that you need to have dopamine inside of this brain area in order for the animals to mate. And it looks like nitric oxide somehow, and the chemistry of that is still unclear, but somehow nitric oxide is sort of facilitating this release so that you would get as much dopamine as you can when a rat is mating. rat mating goes through a series of very coordinated steps. It's not similar to human mating in that way, because that can happen in many different ways. But it seems that dopamine, nitric oxide, the medial preoptic area, all of these are as important for human mating as they are for animal mating. So more sex. So sorry, I forgot about that animation. It's all good. So what does this look like behaviorally? I very sort of briefly went over the physiology, but I'm interested in what's causing this nitric oxide. So what is making the nitric oxide be more released? So what could possibly be causing, in a natural sense, these animals to make more so that they're sort of better at mating, if you will? So what happens when you have a male rat and you introduce an estrus female who's ready to mate? The first thing that happens is he smells the female vigorously. He'll usually come up and smell her for a few minutes, chase her around and just keep smelling her ears, her genital region, he can't get enough. He smells everything. And then what looks like happens in the brain is that excitatory neural inputs from the olfactory bulb, so the smell causes a release of an excitatory neurotransmitter called glutamate. But it gets excited, and that seems to cause the increase of nitric oxide, that enzyme is enhanced, and dopamine inside of the male's medial preoptic area, and copulation begins. So you need this increase first before he'll actually begin to try to copulate. It takes a few minutes, especially for a naive male. As he copulates, as he continues to go, dopamine continues to increase roughly 300% from baseline, depending upon the animal. And then at a critical point, a second very large excitatory input arrives and the male ejaculates. And then he goes through something called the post-ejaculatory interval, where he can't mate for a little while. It's true in every mammal species, which is what I have the Z's down here for. He doesn't actually go to sleep, and rats' post-ejaculatory interval is anywhere from 5 to 25 minutes, depending upon his experience. But it's very different for other mammals. But if an experienced male can, in a 30-minute mating session, do something like 4 or 5 ejaculations, so they can be pretty quick. But they always have this little interval afterwards. All right. Where I became interested is that when I went to my postdoctoral laboratory, it was sort of colloquially known that experience makes a difference. If you have an experienced male animal who's copulated before, his behavior will be very different than a virgin male animal, or naive, as we tend to say. So this would be your naive male. Experienced male rats are usually more efficient copulators than naive male rats. Not that naive male rats can't, but they're not very efficient at it. It just takes them a little while. I actually liked my naive males because you could really see the behavior. You could watch them smell the female. You could watch their attempts, but they eventually get the hang of it. Sorry. But experienced males will initiate successful sexual behavior very quickly, usually within a minute of being introduced to the female. So immediately they'll start to copulate. Their post-ejaculatory interval is shorter, which means they can achieve more mating sessions. In an evolutionary sense, this is a good thing, more successful mating. And they seem to be mediated by, I love these pictures, a robust increase in dopamine sooner. So what happens physiologically speaking is that you have an experienced male who gets that dopamine burst really fast. A naive male takes a few minutes of smelling a female before his dopamine starts to rise. If you're measuring from an experienced male, within 30 seconds, you can start to see, like if you took a sample 30 seconds later, you can start to see the dopamine rise. And as we know, that might be facilitated by nitric oxide. That chemistry, that reaction is happening faster. So basically, they go from duds to studs, which is what we call them in the lab. We have stud males and dud males. Interestingly, and this is what really piqued my interest, if you take a naive male and you merely odor expose him to an estrus female for a few days. So if you put him in a room with an estrus female, we'll usually put the female above and the male beneath so he can smell her genital region or her paws, which is where a lot of their scent is. Just expose them for a few days, and they've never mated, they're still naive, and then you put him with the female, he will act like an experienced male. So he will mount immediately, he will have a short post-ejaculatory interval, So we called this learning without doing. So basically just by smelling her or being nearby, they seem to learn without doing. They somehow get the motor pattern down without ever having done it before. And this was observed, and it was really in a 2012 paper, which is when I went to my postdoctoral lab. So it was a really interesting thing, and my first thought was, there has to be something with the olfactory bulb. Something has to be going on. Something with that chemistry or the signal coming from the olfactory bulb via the amygdala. And I was really interested in whether or not it was nitric oxide, because that seemed to be the primer of dopamine, if you will. And so the thought was, we called this the exposure effect. How might the exposure effect occur? So we know, and this was, I did not do this research, but it was done previously in the lab. If nitric oxide is blocked when males are exposed to the smell of females, so if you take this male and let him smell the female, but you put a drug that blocks nitric oxide, or it blocks the enzyme that creates nitric oxide, the improvement in copulatory ability that is usually seen is gone. So they don't act like studs. They don't have this exposure effect. But what no one had done was to show whether or not injections of drugs to enhance nitric oxide, so to enhance that enzyme, could make a male suddenly act like an exposed male or an experienced male. So might it mimic the improvement in copulatory ability? So if I took a rat and gave them this nitric oxide enhancer, but didn't let him smell the females, would he act like an experienced male? So is nitric oxide the thing, the enhancement? So that's the research that I'll sort of talk about. So my question really was, is this exposure effect of smell mediated by nitric oxide? So is that signal coming from the olfactory bulb making the nitric oxide enzyme somehow be enhanced? And that chemistry is still unclear, but I was sort of interested in the question overall. This manuscript is currently in preparation, hopefully submitted next month. What I used these were my rats. So you might think of a white lab rat when you think of rats, but these particular animals that aren't white are actually better maters, so I use them in my lab. They're called Long Evans rats. They were all naive and all not exposed to females at any point in their life other than their mother. So they were kept separate from females after they were weaned, so if they had sisters in their litter. But after they were weaned, they were kept separate in a different room. They never mated. And so I had one group where I let them do their thing. I let them be exposed to females every other day for a total of 7 exposures. So it took 2 weeks so they could smell the female. Another group where I injected a nitric oxide enhancer. So this drug, it's called SMP, sodium nitroprusside, will enhance the activity of the enzyme that makes nitric oxide. I put it into their belly every other day. And then I had a group where I gave the same drug but directly to their brain, so into the medial preoptic area. I had these 2 groups because we were interested in seeing if whether or not the dilation effects of sodium nitroprusside in the blood might explain some of the sexual activity, sort of like giving them rat Viagra, basically. And I was curious to see if it was any different. And then I had a 4th group that had cannulae into their NPOA and then just had saline as a control. So they had the same brain surgery, but they did not get the drug to that area of the brain. Excuse me. And then after this took about 2 weeks for these groups to get their exposures, and then they were given 1 30-minute session with a female, and all sex behavior was videotaped and scored by me or by a student of mine at Wabash College, which is where I previously was, named Bradley Wise. So I had an undergraduate collaborator that worked with me on this work. He was a good sport. Lots of videotape that he had to score. So some of the results, I won't go into all of them, but I want to give some of the big results. And so what we showed was that animals who had this enzyme activator administered directly to their medial preoptic area achieved as many ejaculations as animals that had been exposed to females. So they acted like studs, basically. Usually a naive male achieves 1 ejaculation, that's average, in 30 minutes. These animals achieved 2 or 3, which is more like an experienced male. So they acted more experienced. They had high numbers of successful sexual attempts. These are known as intromissions. This is where the penis is actually inserted into the vagina. A naive male has trouble with that at first. And so they were very good at actually achieving what they set out to do. And we did find that the nitric oxide agonists in the brain or the body seem to lower the time needed to recover, so that post-ejaculatory interval. So either the brain or the body, they had shorter intervals between their attempted mating sessions. Excuse me. And so we sort of analyzed this, and we thought it led to maybe steadier and faster copulatory behavior. So it seems like that if the nitric oxide is being enhanced by smell, which is what it seems to be and is the next step in my research to really show that, it leads to this steadier, faster behavior that we see in the exposed males. And these are just some graphs of some of the results. So these are the control saline-infused animals. This is the duration of their post-ejaculatory interval. So these are the exposed males that we expect to do well. And these are injections to the body and the brain. So you can see they all look very similar to each other. The stars indicate statistical significance. Here is the number of intromissions. So this is the amount of times the penis was successfully inserted into the vagina. And so these are our naive virgin males, and these are the ones with SMP to the body. And here's our exposed males, and here's our males that got the drug to the brain. And down here is the mean ejaculations achieved, with it about doubling in the animals that got the drug to the brain and the exposed animals. So they do act like the, the exposed or the fake experience animals, if you will. And so the larger picture is just that dopamine allows for sex behavior to occur, perhaps via nitric oxide stimulation. And critically, nitric oxide may be pivotal or at least contributing to the learning without doing aspect of sex behavior, demonstrated by the change in behavior seen in males from the mere exposure effect to females. I have a lot more work to do here, particularly on the anatomy, which is what I'm hoping to do here at St. Mary's, as well as my other research lines. And if anyone's interested, I'm happy to answer questions about what I'm planning on doing here. I wanted to thank some of my collaborators. That's my student who's now at Cornell from Wabash College. This is my postdoctoral lab, and I hope to have names to put here really soon as my lab is getting set up here at St. Mary's. But the support here has been wonderful, and I also want to thank Laura for putting together a great symposium. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, excellent. So our third presenter today is Dr. Jen Roselle, and the title of her talk is Insights into the Restoration of Hearing Loss. You can go ahead and get it pulled up while I talk about you a little bit. So Dr. Roselle is in her first year here as an assistant professor in the Department of Biology. And her research focuses on the development of the inner ear as a model to investigate potential methods to restore hearing loss. And as aforementioned, she also, in her year here, has been working on developing a neuroscience program. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Roselle.
Great, thank you. I'm going to put that back a little bit, maybe. All right, so I was jealous of everybody else's titles, so I added a little extra. What can chickens tell us? Everybody else's was kind of funny, and yeah, so I didn't make it into the printed bulletin, but here it is. All right, so my research is looking at development of specific cells that are important for the function of hearing. So as I tell my students, where did Laura go? She must have stepped out. Why should I care? I don't use the same exact phrasing, but I do say, tell your audience why they should care about this topic. And this is kind of an easy one, right? Hearing deficits or problems with cells within the ear lead to hearing loss. So I am interested in looking at specific cells in the ear. We'll go through a little bit of anatomy that can lead to hearing loss. So the external ear and the ear canal are basically the method for transmitting sound waves to the eardrum for vibrations. The three middle ear bones then transfer those vibrations into the coiled portion of the cochlea where hearing occurs. So what's important are these cells inside of the cochlea called hair cells, not to be confused with hair follicles. They are called hair cells because of this little bundle that sits on the apical surface. Just as important as the hair cells are the auditory neurons that connect to the hair cells and transfer information about sound to the brain for perception. So here's where the brain tells you what you are hearing. So I'm really interested in these two particular cell types, the hair cells and the auditory neurons and their function in hearing. So again, if there is abnormal development, absence of these cells, you will have significant hearing deficits or complete hearing loss. But there are two types of hearing loss. Conductive, which is a problem either in the auditory canal or the middle ear. So sometimes there are structural changes, bone malformation, which is going to decrease hearing. I'm specifically interested in sensorineural hearing loss, which is a problem with loss or damage to the sensory hair cells or the auditory neurons, which are connecting to them and transferring information to the brain. There are multiple causes of sensorineural hearing loss, and the one that I'm going to focus on is presbycusis. So not as difficult as Terry's presentation, because what this means is nothing about sex. This means as you get older, you lose hearing. So this is age-related hearing loss, presbycusis. And I will attempt to demonstrate. I have a couple of students. Yes. All right. So I will attempt to demonstrate presbycusis. Normal hearing in humans, the range is from about 20 hertz to about 20,000 hertz. So here is the normal hearing. Above is ultrasonic. So I'm going to play a couple of tones at different pitches. Right. So what I want you to do, I'm going to go up here a little bit, is if you can hear the tone, please raise your hand. And okay. Hopefully I'm not blasting anybody out. All right, we're going to jump up here. Some hands are not going up. Just so everybody, if you're not looking around. All right. The students are the only ones that are raising their hands. I can't hear it either. Sorry, I let it play maybe too long. All right. So as a demonstration of presbycusis, so hearing loss, whether you have gone to rock concerts or not your entire life or always been in charge of mowing the lawn, which is going to be sound-induced hearing loss, is going to happen through aging. Normally happens in males earlier than females, and it hits those higher pitched sounds first and then works its way down, which is why two students in the audience could hear the 18,000 hertz while no one else could, right? Mary couldn't, that's okay. I couldn't hear it. All right. So what's really important is that in mammals, this hearing loss is permanent. And I will tell you why. So if we look in the normal ear, right, this is a mouse. We can see these bundles here. This is the apical surface of those hair cells. So 1 row of inner hair cells, 3 rows of outer hair cells. You can see these V-shaped structures indicating the location of the hair cell. If we look at an old mouse, which in their life can, sometimes be just several months, what we see is some disorganization, and we're missing some of those bundles, which means those hair cells are dying. When the hair cells die, the neurons die along with them. They work together as a team. So when the hair cells are damaged or die, you will eventually lose those neurons as well if they have no one to connect to. What can chickens tell us? I don't think you expected that this is where that would come up, but what they can tell us, in mammals, very common model organism, we just saw that aging will cause this loss of hair cells, and they do not come back, but they do in chicks, birds, and fish. So if you damage them, either by injury, insult, loud sounds, or ototoxic drugs, or simply by aging, they will be able to regenerate the hair cells and the neurons that have been injured or damaged in whatever way you choose to do that. So I am interested in developmental pathways, instructions for normal development in mammals, but also in chicks as a comparison. What are the instructions for a cell to become a hair cell? So in development, specifically early development, cells are making all kinds of decisions. Am I going to be a muscle cell? Am I going to be a skin cell? Am I going to be a neuron? So these are very specific decisions, but what are those factors and instructions that are telling cells in early development before they know what they're going to be when they grow up to become a hair cell or an auditory neuron? And specifically, how are those instructions different in chicks versus mammals, or fish versus mammals, that allow them to regenerate these if they are damaged through injury, insult, or age? So what could those factors be, and can we then translate that into potential treatments for hearing loss or hearing disorders to regenerate these cells if they are damaged? Can we either give them the set of instructions that they had early in embryogenesis to develop into hair cells and neurons, or could we modify these instructions to be more like chicks or fish to kind of trick them into regenerating if there is damage in the system? So I am asking questions at this basic level, trying to find the genes that are the instructors. What genes are telling the cells to become hair cells? What genes are telling the cells to become auditory neurons? So that we may be able to use that information to regenerate hair cells. So this is not my cover. But hair cell regeneration was the focus, or one of the articles in this journal. However, this indicates that we've had a lot of success. In fact, in vitro, that is the case. We're pretty good at vitro in accomplishing this. That means in a dish. We're spectacularly bad at this in vivo. So translating this into an actual animal has not worked. Very, very difficult. The cells just die. They're not happy. So again, in a dish, we can add in lots of factors that they like to promote this differentiation, again, which is where my focus is. What are the instructions we have to give them to become this cell type? And then, can we put it in an animal and make it work? We're a little bit better at regenerating auditory neurons. In general, auditory neurons are a little less temperamental than the sensory hair cells. So this has been accomplished, but you will see, I use this picture, there's a lot of lines going on, but what's happening here is auditory neurons are being injected into this region to see if they can find their target, hair cells, right here. So you can see all of these injected neurons and follow their path by following the different colored lines, and one of them gets to the right place. So not only do we need to make the right kind of neuron, and specifically an auditory neuron, but it also has to get to the right place. It not only has to interact with the hair cell, but it also has to make a connection in the brain that is in the right location, or there will not be a functional hair cell neuron transmission to the brain for perception. But again, we are a little bit better at this, not only in making the neurons, but in the in vitro and in vivo experiments, a little bit better than we are with hair cells. In addition, cochlear implants are a method for trying to restore permanent hearing loss. So deaf individuals that receive cochlear implants basically have non-functional hair cells and auditory neurons. So what happens is an electrode is inserted into the cochlea, right? And they're basically mimicking those hair cells. The hair cells are gone in these cases. However, hair cells require connections with the auditory neurons to then connect with the brain, right? So we can use this cochlear implant to restore some hearing, but it's absolutely critical to have auditory neurons available to make these connections. And the more auditory neurons that are present, the more connections you make, and the better the cochlear implants function. The more they can discriminate different frequencies, the better the hearing is. So even if we can't regenerate hair cells and make things perfect, we may be able to, by generating auditory neurons, improve cochlear implants to improve the function to restore that hearing loss. So unfortunately, I don't have specific answers for you. This is ongoing research, so this is my first year at St. Mary's. I have some juniors that are starting their comp projects, and they are all selecting genes that have the potential to play a role in determining the cell fate of hair cells and auditory neurons, which will hopefully then translate into those treatments for curing or restoring hearing deficits and disorders. But if you are interested, I can give you a list of genes. I just didn't add those here. And since I was last, I think I can end here because questions is next.
So we do have time for about 1 or 2 questions. So if anybody has any questions for any of our panelists, feel free to ask. I see a couple hands. We'll go Professor Zachman.
I have one question for Terry. So this is obviously from a non-science person, but remind me again what the strings of letters that you were able to, the proteins? Yeah. Amino acids. Okay. How do you change those? That was my question. Is it just a matter of adding and?
Yeah, we actually use chemical synthesis to link up the amino acids just as if they're beads in a chain. So we add one, then we add the next, then we add the next, and you can change using synthesis. You can change which order or what the identity of each one of those amino acids is. Oh, it's a great question.
And then my question for Terry was, how do you know? In this case, you were answering your question based on what you saw them do, right? Observation. But how do you know what's going on in the other cases where you're talking about what's happening in the brain? How do you know that? How do you measure that?
It's a good question, and that's sort of an ongoing aspect of my research. So you have the olfactory bulb, there are neurons there, they send their axons to the amygdala, which then send their axons to the MPOA. So if you're looking for which neurons are talking to which neurons, you need to do an anatomical study. So I could take these animals, remove their brains, and then look at, after they've mated, usually right after they've mated, you euthanize them, poor things. But then you would take their brain out and you would stain the cells and see which enzyme was active, if that one was connected to a neuron coming from the amygdala that was then coming from the olfactory bulb, so you trace the neuron with a stain. So unfortunately, you can't right now in rats do anatomy and physiology at the same time, but you have to do it post-mortem. But that's how I would do that, and that's one area where my research needs to go, because I have... Yeah, you can do you can do that, but my areas are subcortical, so with the electrodes you can look at the cortex, but this is all deep in the brain. And so someday I can stick maybe a deep electrode in there, but right now I really want to just map out the basic anatomy. Some of that has been done, and some of it hasn't been specific to nitric oxide, so that's one of my next ways.
Thank you. No problem. I think I saw Dean Hess. Did you have a question?
I was kind of curious to know how the death of those hair cells related to the pitches that you were. Why is it high frequency loss?
You can use either mic.
So high frequency, it's the structure of the cochlea of the turn. So it is the cochlea and the brain are mapped together. So it's tonotopic. And it's just the location of the hair cells that are injured first that are hitting the high frequency area, which is why you lose those first.
Any other questions for our presenters at this time? Well, the poster session is starting. We're basically right at 4 o'clock. I'm sure our presenters are willing to stick around if you have any additional questions. So please join us. Posters are on the